Hey guys, tonight we begin with the daily grind of an African tribe chief. And trust me, it's nothing like your morning coffee routine. Think being a CEO is stressful. Try managing a community where your biggest HR issue might involve settling disputes over goat ownership while ensuring everyone's fed, protected, and spiritually fulfilled. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into a world where your alarm clock is a rooster and your office has no walls. Let's start with the biggest misconception about African tribal chiefs. Most people picture some guy in a Hollywood movie, sitting on a throne made of elephant tusks, barking orders while servants fan him with palm leaves. In reality, being a tribal chief was like being the world's most overworked middle manager, community therapist, judge, spiritual advisor, and weather forecaster, all rolled into one exhausting package. This wasn't some leisurely position where you lounge around making royal decrees. It was more like being the mayor of a small town, except your town moves seasonally, your citizens might include livestock, and your city council meetings could involve interpreting dreams. Think of it this way. Imagine if your job required you to wake up before dawn, check on literally everyone in your neighborhood, make sure they're all getting along, resolve their family disputes, plan the community's meals for the week, organize work schedules, lead religious ceremonies, negotiate with neighboring communities, keep track of the weather patterns, maintain oral histories going back generations, and do all of this without a single vacation day, sick leave, or even a proper office. Oh, and if anything goes wrong, from crop failure to interpersonal drama, guess who gets blamed? That's right, the chief. It's like being a helicopter parent to an entire community of adults, and just like helicopter parenting, it probably gave most chiefs premature grey hair and chronic anxiety. The Hollywood version shows chiefs lounging in luxury, but the reality was more like being on call 24/7 for a job that combined the stress levels of an emergency room doctor, a marriage counselor, and a meteorologist, all while maintaining the patience of a kindergarten teacher and the wisdom of a philosophy professor. Traditional African societies weren't the primitive, simple communities that colonial narratives like to portray. They were sophisticated social organizations with complex governance systems that would make modern political scientists weep with envy. These weren't societies lacking structure. They were communities with intricate checks and balances that often worked better than whatever political chaos was happening in Europe at the time. If you thought traditional African societies were just people randomly wandering around the savannah, think again. These were carefully organized communities with governance systems so nuanced that anthropologists are still trying to figure out all the moving parts. The chief's role varied dramatically depending on the specific culture, region, and time period, but universally, it was never the dictatorial position that outsiders imagined. In many societies, chiefs were more like constitutional monarchs with a council of elders who could, and would, tell them when they were being ridiculous. Imagine trying to make an executive decision, only to have your grandmother, 3 uncles, and the village-wise woman show up to explain exactly why your idea is terrible and what you should do instead. That's basically how many traditional African governance systems worked. Collective decision-making disguised as individual leadership. Some chiefs inherited their positions through complex lineage systems that made European royal succession look simple. Others were chosen through elaborate selection processes that considered everything from their ability to mediate disputes to their knowledge of traditional law, their spiritual connections, and sometimes their ability to literally wrestle other candidates. Picture a job interview that includes a background check going back 7 generations, a comprehensive exam on local history and law, a psychological evaluation by the community elders, and occasionally a physical fitness test that might involve actual combat, makes modern hiring practices look absolutely quaint, doesn't it? The chief's compound wasn't a palace. It was more like a combination city hall, courthouse, community center, and bed and breakfast for traveling dignitaries. It was the hub of community life, where people came to settle disputes, seek advice, participate in ceremonies, and generally hang out. The chief's family often lived alongside advisors, servants, guests, and sometimes refugees or people seeking protection. Privacy was about as common as air conditioning, which is to say, completely non-existent. These societies had developed sustainable practices, conflict resolution mechanisms, educational systems, and social safety nets that worked so well that many communities thrived for centuries without major social upheaval. Meanwhile, European societies were busy having religious wars, plague outbreaks, and political revolutions every few decades. The irony is almost too much to handle. Meet Kwame, a fictional composite chief based on historical accounts from various West African societies, who will follow through a typical day that starts before the sun comes up and ends well after it goes down. Kwame inherited his position from his father's brother after a selection process that involved proving he could recite the genealogy of every major family in the community, demonstrate his knowledge of traditional law by resolving mock disputes, and show he could maintain his composure during a ceremony involving very loud drums and very strong palm wine. Think of it as the world's most comprehensive job interview, except it lasted 3 months and included public performance requirements. But here's the twist that Hollywood never shows. Kwame didn't actually want to be chief. He had been perfectly happy working as a skilled craftsman, creating beautiful pottery that was traded throughout the region. He had artistic ambitions, a wife he adored, and plans to expand his workshop. But when his uncle died unexpectedly, the council of elders basically showed up at his house and said, "Congratulations, you're now responsible for the welfare of 200 people, their livestock, their crops, their spiritual well-being, and their general happiness. Also, you start tomorrow." It's like being voluntold to run a small corporation, except your employees are your relatives, neighbors, and lifelong friends, which somehow makes it both easier and infinitely more complicated. Kwame's first major test as chief came during a drought that threatened the community's survival. The previous year's harvest had been disappointing, the seasonal rains were late, and tensions were rising as families worried about feeding their children. Traditional knowledge suggested several possible solutions: relocating to areas with better water access, implementing strict rationing systems, or conducting specific ceremonies to appease the spirits responsible for rainfall. But each option had serious drawbacks and vocal opponents within the community. The situation became even more complex when a neighboring community, facing similar problems, suggested a joint migration to new territory that happened to be claimed by yet another group. Suddenly, Kwame found himself negotiating a potential alliance that could save his people while trying to avoid a conflict that could destroy them. He spent weeks in diplomatic discussions that made modern peace negotiations look straightforward, all while managing daily crises in his own community and maintaining the calm, confident demeanor that people expected from their leader. The resolution involved a creative solution that combined elements from multiple proposals: a partial migration of some families to temporary camps near seasonal water sources, the implementation of communal farming techniques that maximized crop yields from remaining fertile areas, and a series of reciprocal agreements with neighboring communities that shared resources during the crisis. It worked, but the stress probably took 5 years off Kwame's life, and that was just his first major challenge as chief. And if you think managing a drought crisis while keeping everyone fed, happy, and optimistic sounds challenging, wait until you hear about his daily routine during normal times, which somehow managed to be even more exhausting. This wasn't just about one man's challenging job description. The chief's effectiveness literally determined whether people lived or died, prospered or struggled, maintained their cultural identity or saw it slowly disappear. In societies without written laws, the chief served as the living embodiment of legal precedent, cultural memory, and community values. If the chief made poor decisions, forgot important traditions, or failed to maintain relationships with neighboring communities, the consequences rippled through generations. The pressure was immense, because traditional African societies were often democracies in disguise. If a chief consistently failed to serve the community's interests, there were mechanisms for removing them from power. This wasn't medieval Europe, where kings ruled by divine right and people just had to deal with incompetent leadership. African communities had developed systems of accountability that included everything from public criticism to formal removal processes. A chief who lost the confidence of the people didn't just lose their job, they often lost their social standing, their family's honor, and sometimes their right to remain in the community. But the stakes went beyond individual success or failure. Chiefs were responsible for preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge that had been passed down for centuries. They maintained the oral histories, the traditional laws, the spiritual practices, and the social customs that define their people's identity. In many ways, each chief was a walking library, a living archive of everything that made their community unique. When a chief died or was removed from power, there was always the risk that crucial knowledge would die with them. The complexity of the role meant that chiefs had to be simultaneously conservative and innovative, preserving tradition while adapting to changing circumstances, maintaining authority while remaining accountable to the community, projecting confidence while constantly learning from their mistakes. It required a combination of skills that would challenge even the most capable modern leaders. But Kwame's selection process and drought crisis were just the beginning of what would become a lifetime of impossible expectations and overwhelming responsibilities. The daily routine of a traditional African chief involved a workload that would make modern executives quit and become subsistence farmers just for the mental health benefits. From sunrise to sunset, and often well beyond, chiefs managed complex networks of relationships, responsibilities, and competing interests that required the diplomatic skills of a UN negotiator, the patience of a Buddhist monk, and the physical stamina of a marathon runner. They mediated disputes that ranged from minor disagreements about property boundaries to major conflicts that could split families apart for generations. They made decisions about resource allocation that affected everyone's survival, organized community labor projects that required coordination, involving military logistics, and maintained spiritual practices that kept the community connected to their ancestors and their land. And just when you think you understand the scope of the job, remember that chiefs didn't have assistants, secretaries, or administrative staff. No one was taking their calls, managing their calendars, or handling their correspondence. Every conversation, every decision, every ceremony had to be personally managed by the chief themselves. It's like being the CEO, HR director, legal counsel, and chaplain of a company where everyone is related to you and has known you since you were a child, who wet the bed and cried during thunderstorms. The daily routine of a traditional African chief began while most people were still dreaming about their problems instead of actually solving them. Unlike the common assumption that leadership in traditional societies meant lounging around until noon and then making a few important pronouncements, the reality was that chiefs typically started their days around 4 a.m., which puts them in the same category as bakery workers, dairy farmers, and people who voluntarily sign up for morning workout classes. Slightly insane, but incredibly dedicated. The pre-dawn hours weren't spent checking social media or grabbing coffee. They were devoted to what can only be described as spiritual and administrative multitasking that would make modern productivity experts weep with envy. Chiefs used these quiet hours for personal reflection, reviewing the previous day's decisions, planning for upcoming challenges, and connecting with the spiritual realm through prayer, meditation, or consultation with ancestral spirits. Think of it as a combination of journaling, strategic planning, and conference calls with deceased relatives who may or may not be taking your calls, depending on whether you've been keeping up with the proper rituals. This routine developed because chiefs needed uninterrupted time to think, something that would become increasingly impossible once the community woke up and began presenting them with an endless stream of questions, problems, complaints, and requests that ranged from the genuinely urgent to the completely ridiculous. The early morning hours were like a brief sanctuary of sanity before diving into a day that would test every leadership skill they possessed and several they'd have to improvise on the spot. The morning routine also served a practical purpose. Chiefs needed to be visible and available to their communities from sunrise to sunset, which meant their personal time had to be carved out when everyone else was unconscious. It was the only time of day when they could process information, make decisions, and prepare for whatever chaos the day might bring without interruption from community members who needed immediate answers to questions like, should I marry my cousin's neighbor? Or do you think the chickens are plotting against us? Take our friend Kwame's typical morning routine, which started at 4 a.m. with what could generously be called executive prayer time, but was more accurately described as, please let me survive another day without accidentally starting a war or making a decision that gets everyone killed. Kwame would begin by offering prayers to the ancestral spirits, which involved elaborate rituals that included specific offerings, carefully worded requests for guidance, and occasional bargaining that sounded suspiciously like, if you help me handle today's disputes without anyone getting stabbed, I promise to organize that festival you've been requesting for the past 3 years. The spiritual consultation wasn't just ceremonial. It was practical problem-solving disguised as religious practice. Chiefs often used these morning sessions to work through complex decisions by essentially having imaginary conversations with deceased relatives who were presumably wiser than the living ones constantly asking them for advice. It was like having a board of directors meeting, except half the board was dead and communicated through dreams, omens, and occasional possession experiences that would make corporate retreat activities look absolutely mundane. After the spiritual consultation, Kwame would spend time reviewing what we might call his mental filing system, the vast collection of laws, precedents, genealogies, and traditional knowledge that he carried in his head. Chiefs were essentially walking databases who had to maintain accurate recall of information that included every family's history, every legal decision made in the past several decades, every property boundary dispute that had ever been settled, and every marriage alliance that might affect current politics. Imagine trying to keep track of the family drama from several seasons of reality TV shows, except the drama actually matters, and making mistakes could result in tribal warfare. One morning, Kwame spent an hour mentally reviewing a property dispute that had been simmering for months between two families whose great-grandfathers had apparently made conflicting claims about a particularly fertile plot of land. The original dispute had occurred 40 years earlier, and the details had been passed down through oral tradition, which meant Kwame had to sort through multiple versions of the story, each told from different family perspectives and modified by decades of retelling. It was like being asked to solve a mystery where all the witnesses had selective memory and personal agendas. The complexity of such disputes was staggering. Kwame had to consider not just the original land claim, but also how the families had used the land over the decades, what improvements they'd made, how the dispute affected their relationships with other community members, whether resolving it in favor of one family create precedents that could affect other property disputes, and how his decision would impact the community's overall harmony. Modern lawyers would need teams of researchers and months of preparation to handle such cases, but Kwame had to keep all the relevant information in his head and make decisions that would satisfy both fairness and community stability. Another morning ritual involved what could be called weather forecasting and agricultural planning, which sounds much more scientific than it actually was. Kwame would observe natural signs, wind patterns, animal behavior, plant growth, and various other indicators that his predecessors had identified as relevant to predicting seasonal changes. Then he'd mentally review the community's agricultural, schedule, food storage situations, and labor needs to identify potential problems before they became crises. This agricultural planning required Kwame to think like a combination meteorologist, economist, and logistics coordinator. He had to consider not just what crops to plant when, but also how to organize community labor for planting and harvesting, how to manage food distribution in lean seasons, what to do if the rains came early or late, and how to maintain seed stocks for future planting. The mental calculations involved would challenge modern agricultural specialists using sophisticated computer models, but Kwame had to do it all in his head, while also preparing for a day filled with interpersonal drama and administrative challenges. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing in traditional African societies ever was, despite what simplified anthropological accounts might suggest. The morning routine that sounds so organized and efficient was constantly disrupted by contradictory information, competing priorities, and the basic chaos of managing a community where everyone had opinions and most people weren't shy about sharing them at inconvenient times. Complicating factors included the fact that different spiritual traditions within the same community provide conflicting guidance about the same issues. Kwame might receive what he interpreted as ancestral advice, suggesting one course of action, only to have his chief spiritual advisor report dreams that recommended something completely different. Meanwhile, his council of elders might have their own opinions based on their interpretation of traditional law, and his wife might have practical concerns that contradicted everyone else's advice. It was like trying to make decisions by committee when half the committee members were dead, a quarter were asleep, and the rest were arguing with each other about details that happened before anyone currently alive was born. The contradictory evidence came from the inherent complexity of oral traditions that had been passed down through multiple generations. Different families might have preserved different versions of the same stories, laws, or historical events, and each version would be presented as the definitive truth. Kwame regularly found himself trying to reconcile accounts that contradicted each other in significant ways, like being asked to solve a jigsaw puzzle where different pieces came from different boxes, and some of the boxes might have been from completely different puzzles altogether. Different perspectives within the community meant that Kwame's morning planning sessions often had to account for the fact that his eventual decisions would be viewed through various lenses of self-interest, family loyalty, political alliance, and traditional authority. What seemed like a straightforward solution to one problem create 3 new problems for different segments of the community. It was like playing multi-dimensional chess, where some of the pieces could move in ways that weren't covered in the rulebook, and every move had to be evaluated for its effects on games being played on other boards. The situation was more complex than it appeared, because traditional societies, despite their reputation for stability and consensus, were actually constantly evolving and adapting to changing circumstances. Kwame had to balance respect for tradition with the practical need to address new challenges that previous generations hadn't encountered. This meant making decisions that honored ancestral wisdom, while acknowledging that some ancestral wisdom might not apply to current situations, which was roughly equivalent to trying to maintain family traditions while simultaneously revolutionizing them. Modern analogies fail to capture the complexity because we don't have comparable situations where individual leaders must simultaneously serve as judge, therapist, spiritual guide, economic planner, weather forecaster, historian, and family counselor for an entire community, while maintaining the respect and authority necessary to make their decisions stick. The result of this intensive morning routine was that chiefs like Kwame entered each day armed with more information than they could possibly process and more responsibilities than any reasonable person should accept, who was affected by these early morning decisions. Literally everyone in the community because the chief's mental state, decision-making framework, and spiritual preparation would influence every interaction and judgment throughout the day. How people responded to their chief's morning preparations varied depending on their relationship to the chief and their understanding of the role's demands. Family members often served as informal advisors and sounding boards, which meant they were frequently awakened before dawn to participate in discussions about community issues that might seem abstract until they affected their daily lives. Imagine being roused from sleep to help your father figure out whether the community should plant more millet or cassava this season, knowing that your answer might influence whether everyone has enough to eat next year. The institutional reactions to the chief's morning routine were built into the community structure through various forms of support and accountability. Elder councils expected to be consulted on major decisions, spiritual advisors provided guidance and interpretation, and community members had established ways of providing feedback on the chief's performance. The system was designed to prevent any individual from making decisions in isolation, but it also meant that the chief's morning preparation had to account for multiple layers of consultation and approval. Long-term implications included the development of decision-making processes that were incredibly thorough, but sometimes painfully slow. Chiefs who took their morning preparations seriously tended to make better decisions, but they also tended to overthink situations that might have benefited from faster action. The community benefited from thoughtful leadership, but sometimes suffered from leadership paralysis when quick decisions were needed. The ongoing narrative of daily leadership was shaped by these morning routines because they established patterns of reflection, consultation, and planning that influenced how chiefs approached challenges throughout their tenure. Chiefs who developed strong morning routines often became known for their wisdom and measured responses to crises. Those who neglected this preparation frequently found themselves making reactive decisions that created more problems than they solved. The system also created interesting dynamics around the chief's family life, because the demands of early morning preparation meant that their personal relationships were constantly interrupted by professional responsibilities. Kwame's wife often joked that she was married to the community first and her husband second, which was funny until it wasn't, particularly during busy seasons when the morning routine extended well into what should have been family time. This intensive daily preparation created chiefs who were exceptionally well informed but potentially overwhelmed, deeply connected to their communities but sometimes isolated by their responsibilities, and highly effective decision makers who occasionally suffered from decision fatigue before most people had even finished breakfast. Meanwhile, as Kwame completed his morning routine and prepared to face the day's challenges, the rest of the community was beginning their own daily routines, many of which would intersect with his responsibilities in ways that were both predictable and completely surprising. The transition from private preparation to public leadership was the beginning of what could only be described as a day-long performance where every word, gesture, and decision would be observed, analyzed, and remembered by people who had known him since he was a child. Connection to the previous content reveals how the morning routine served as the foundation for everything that followed. Without proper preparation, the day's challenges would be overwhelming. But even with excellent preparation, the demands of community leadership would test every skill and resource the chief possessed. Building anticipation for the next section, we'll explore how this carefully planned morning routine immediately collided with the chaotic reality of community life, where well-thought-out plans met the unstoppable force of human nature, unexpected crises, and the general tendency of life to ignore everyone's best-laid plans. The day's first interactions would reveal whether all that morning preparation was worth the lost sleep, or whether being a chief was essentially an exercise in improvisation disguised as traditional authority. If the pre-dawn routine was Kwame's preparation for battle, then the morning audience period was the actual combat, except instead of fighting enemy warriors, He was dealing with community members who had spent all night thinking of creative new ways to make his life complicated, while the morning spiritual preparation was about achieving inner peace and wisdom. The morning audiences were about applying that wisdom to situations that would test the patience of a saint and the diplomatic skills of a career politician. This became important because traditional African societies didn't have formal court systems, police departments, or administrative bureaucracies to handle the countless daily issues that arose in community life. Every dispute, question, complaint, and request eventually made its way to the chief's compound, where people expected immediate attention and usually wanted answers that satisfied everyone involved, violated no traditional laws, set good precedents for future cases, and somehow made everyone feel better about their lives in general. Why this became relevant to understanding traditional leadership is that it reveals the chief's role as the ultimate problem solver, not just for a major community crisis, but for the endless stream of minor interpersonal dramas that could, if handled poorly, escalate into major community crises. It was like being a combination judge, therapist, marriage counselor, property mediator, and occasionally referee for disputes that range from the genuinely serious to the completely absurd, and the chief had to treat each case with appropriate gravity while maintaining their sanity and authority. The morning audience period typically began around sunrise and could last until midday, depending on how many people showed up with problems and how complicated those problems turned out to be. Chiefs couldn't simply schedule appointments or limit the number of cases they heard each day. Community members had the right to seek their chief's judgment, and refusing to hear someone's case was considered a serious breach of traditional responsibility. It was like having an open-door policy for an entire community, except the door never closed, and some of the visitors brought problems that defied logical solution. Consider the morning when Kwame faced what could only be described as the great chicken incident of the dry season, which sounds trivial until you understand that in a community where protein was precious and chickens represented significant economic value, poultry theft was serious business. The case involved 3 families, 2 missing chickens, 1 suspicious dog, and testimony that contradicted itself so thoroughly that Kwame began to suspect that either everyone was lying or the chickens had developed supernatural powers. The complainant was Arma, a widow whose prize-laying hen had vanished during the night. She accused her neighbor Kofi of theft, claiming she had seen him lurking around her chicken coop the previous evening. Kofi vehemently denied the accusation and counter-accused Arma's teenage son of selling the chicken to buy palm wine, presenting as evidence the fact that the boy had been seen with unexplained coins 2 days earlier. The boy denied selling the chicken, but admitted to finding the coins, which he claimed had been left by his deceased father's spirit as a gift. Meanwhile, a third neighbor insisted that a wild dog had been seen in the area and might have taken the chicken, but couldn't explain why there were no feathers or signs of struggle. The background to this dispute revealed layers of complexity that made Kwame's job exponentially harder. Arma and Kofi had been feuding for months over a property boundary. The teenage boy had a reputation for minor mischief, and the mention of spiritual gifts required careful handling, because dismissing such claims could be seen as disrespecting ancestral traditions. Additionally, chicken theft accusations were serious enough to damage someone's reputation permanently, but false accusations were equally damaging to community harmony. What happened during the hearing process illustrated the chief's role as detective, judge, and diplomat simultaneously. Kwame had to question witnesses without appearing to favor any party, evaluate evidence that ranged from physical clues to spiritual claims, consider the broader context of existing disputes, and reach a conclusion that would satisfy community standards of justice while maintaining relationships between neighbors who would continue living next to each other long after the case was resolved. The key players included not just the immediate disputants, but also family members who served as character witnesses, neighbors who provided testimony about what they had or hadn't observed, and community elders who offered opinions about proper procedures and relevant precedents. The drama and conflict arose from the fact that everyone involved had different versions of events, personal motivations for their testimony, and expectations about how the case should be resolved. The resolution required Kwame to make a judgment that addressed the immediate question of the missing chicken, while also dealing with the underlying tensions between the families. He determined that the evidence for theft wasn't conclusive enough to support formal accusations, but the missing chicken still needed to be accounted for. His solution involved requiring Kofi to replace Amos' chicken as a gesture of community goodwill, having the teenage boy perform community service to demonstrate his commitment to honest behavior, and organizing a neighborhood meeting to address property boundary disputes before they generated more conflicts. The broader significance of this case was that it demonstrated how minor disputes could reveal major community tensions and how the chief's handling of seemingly trivial matters affected his reputation for fairness, wisdom, and authority. A poorly handled chicken theft case could undermine confidence in the chief's judgment for months, while a skillfully resolved dispute could strengthen community trust and prevent future conflicts. Another major example involved a marriage dispute that began when a young man's family couldn't agree on the appropriate bride price for his intended wife. The negotiations had been ongoing for weeks, with both families presenting increasingly elaborate arguments about their respective social standing, the bride's valuable skills, the groom's potential as a husband, and various precedents involving bride prices paid for other marriages over the past several decades. What should have been a straightforward negotiation had devolved into a genealogical research project that threatened to delay the marriage indefinitely. The complications included the fact that both families were prominent in the community. The bride and groom were genuinely in love and growing impatient with the extended negotiations, and the dispute was beginning to divide the community into competing camps, supporting different positions on bride price traditions. Kwame found himself mediating between families who had known each other for generations, but were suddenly treating each other like enemies over questions that ultimately concerned the value of tradition as the happiness of young people who just wanted to get married and start their lives together. This wasn't isolated to Kwame's community or even to chicken theft and marriage negotiations. Similar patterns of dispute resolution played out across traditional African societies, with chiefs serving as the final arbiters for conflicts that modern legal systems would handle through multiple specialized institutions, extensive procedural requirements, and teams of trained professionals. Other examples from different communities included land disputes that required chiefs to interpret boundaries established by ancestors who had marked territory in natural landmarks that might have changed over decades, inheritance conflicts that demanded detailed knowledge of family genealogies, and traditional laws governing property transmission, and trade disagreements that could affect relationships between different communities and required diplomatic solutions that satisfied multiple parties with competing interests. The pattern explanation reveals that traditional African dispute resolution systems were based on restorative rather than punitive justice principles. Chiefs typically sought solutions that repaired relationships and maintained community harmony rather than simply punishing wrongdoers or determining winners and losers. This approach required much more time and emotional investment than simple rule enforcement, but it produced outcomes that were generally more stable and acceptable to all parties involved. Why this pattern existed relates to the fundamental structure of traditional African societies, where community members had to continue living and working together regardless of their personal conflicts. Unlike modern societies, where people can move away from their problems or limit their interactions with difficult neighbors, traditional communities required ongoing cooperation for survival. Chiefs had to find solutions that allowed former disputants to collaborate effectively on community projects, participate together in ceremonies, and maintain the social cohesion necessary for collective security and prosperity. Social, political, and economic factors that supported this system included the chief's personal relationships with community members, which provided informal influence that supplemented their formal authority. Chiefs who had grown up in the community understood family dynamics, personal histories, and individual personalities in ways that enabled them to craft solutions tailored to specific situations and people. The system also relied on community pressure to encourage compliance with the chief's decisions, because social isolation was a serious consequence in societies where individual survival depended on group membership. Comparison to other time periods reveals that traditional African dispute resolution systems were often more effective at maintaining social stability than formal legal systems that focused primarily on rule enforcement. While modern legal systems excel at providing consistent application of standardized laws, traditional systems were better at addressing the underlying causes of conflicts and preventing their recurrence. The economic dimension was crucial because most disputes ultimately involved questions about resource allocation, property rights, or economic obligations. Chiefs had to make decisions that balanced individual claims against community needs, immediate concerns against long-term sustainability, and traditional practices against changing circumstances that might require innovative solutions. The effects of this intensive dispute resolution system were far-reaching and complex, creating both benefits and challenges that shaped entire communities for generations. Who benefited from having chiefs serve as comprehensive problem solvers included community members who gained access to justice without formal legal training or expensive procedures, families who could resolve conflicts without permanent relationship damage, and the broader community that maintained social stability through effective conflict management. Who suffered from this system included chiefs themselves, who bore enormous psychological and emotional burdens from constantly mediating other people's problems, and community members whose disputes might be influenced by the chief's personal relationships or biases rather than objective legal standards. Additionally, the system could be slow and cumbersome when quick decisions were needed, and it placed tremendous pressure on chiefs to be simultaneously wise, fair, diplomatic, and practically effective in ways that were probably impossible for any normal human being. Unintended consequences included the development of communities that were highly skilled at conflict resolution, but sometimes hesitant to make decisive changes that might disrupt social harmony. The emphasis on consensus and relationship preservation could lead to situations where necessary, but unpopular decisions were delayed or avoided entirely, potentially creating long-term problems that were more serious than the short-term conflicts. The system was designed to resolve. How this shaped future developments can be seen in the ways that many African societies adapted to colonial and post-colonial legal systems, while maintaining traditional dispute resolution mechanisms for community-level conflicts. The skills and values developed through traditional systems influenced how people interacted with formal courts, political processes, and administrative bureaucracies, often creating hybrid approaches that combine traditional and modern elements. Modern parallels include community mediation programs, restorative justice initiatives, and alternative dispute resolution systems that reflect similar principles to traditional African approaches. The emphasis on relationship repair, community involvement, and customized solutions, rather than standardized punishments, can be found in various contemporary justice innovations that recognize the limitations of purely procedural legal systems. The lessons for modern societies include the importance of having accessible dispute resolution mechanisms that address underlying relationship problems rather than simply determining fault or assigning blame. Traditional African systems demonstrate that effective justice requires understanding the social context of conflicts, the ongoing relationships between disputants, and the community values that should guide resolution processes. However, The system also revealed the dangers of placing too much responsibility on individual leaders without adequate support systems, accountability mechanisms, or limits on their authority. Chiefs who handled dispute resolution effectively became invaluable community assets. But those who made poor decisions or showed favoritism could damage community trust and social cohesion in ways that took years to repair. The balance between efficiency and thoroughness in dispute resolution remains a challenge for both traditional and modern systems, with traditional approaches favoring thoroughness at the expense of speed, while modern systems often prioritize efficiency at the expense of relationship preservation and community healing. Yet, even as Kwame was resolving chicken theft cases and marriage negotiations with the patience of a saint and the wisdom of Solomon, the administrative demands of community leadership are already beginning to pile up like laundry at a college dorm room. The transition from dispute resolution to daily administrative management represented a shift from reactive problem solving to proactive community organization, which required completely different skills and energy levels. The next development in Kwame's daily routine involved what could generously be called executive administration, but was more accurately described as trying to coordinate the activities of an entire community without spreadsheets, calendars, or administrative assistance. This included managing community work projects, organizing food distribution, coordinating with neighboring communities, overseeing religious ceremonies, and somehow keeping track of all the commitments, promises, and obligations that had been made during the morning's dispute resolution session. The connection between morning audiences and administrative duties was that many of the chief's decisions during dispute resolution created follow-up responsibilities that had to be managed throughout the day. Resolving conflicts often involved making commitments about future actions, organizing community service projects, arranging compensation payments, or scheduling follow-up meetings that required ongoing coordination and supervision. Building anticipation. For the next major element, we'll explore how Kwame transitioned from the interpersonal challenges of dispute resolution to the logistical nightmares of community administration, where success required the organizational skills of a project manager, the memory of a human database, and the stamina of someone who apparently never needed sleep or personal time. By the middle of the dry season, Kwame's community had reached what could only be described as a perfect storm of terrible timing, unfortunate circumstances, and the kind of bureaucratic complications that would make modern disaster relief coordinators weep into their emergency management handbooks. The situation that had been simmering quietly in the background of daily administrative duties suddenly exploded into a full-blown crisis that threatened not just the community's comfort, but their actual survival. The description of tensions and problems read like a checklist of everything that could possibly go wrong at the worst possible time. The seasonal rains had failed for the second consecutive year, which meant that crop yields were down by more than half compared to normal harvests. The community's stored grain reserves, carefully managed throughout the previous year, were running dangerously low 3 months earlier than anyone had anticipated. Meanwhile, reports from neighboring communities suggested that everyone in the region was facing similar problems, which meant that the traditional networks of mutual aid and resource sharing were strained beyond their capacity to provide meaningful assistance. Key players involved in this developing crisis included not just Kwame and his immediate advisors, but also the heads of extended families who were responsible for managing household food supplies, the community's traders who maintained relationships with markets in distant regions, spiritual leaders who were being asked to explain why their ancestors seemed to have abandoned their people, and representatives from neighboring communities who were beginning to arrive with their own requests for assistance or proposals for mutual aid agreements that might help everyone survive the crisis. The stakes involved were literally life and death for community members who were already beginning to show signs of malnutrition, particularly children and elderly people whose bodies were least able to cope with extended periods of food scarcity. But the stakes extended beyond immediate survival to include the community's long-term viability, their relationships with neighboring groups, their cultural practices around hospitality and mutual aid, and Kwame's own credibility as a leader, who had promised to protect and provide for his people during his selection ceremony. The crisis represented everything that traditional African chiefs feared most, a situation where their community's survival depended on making decisions with incomplete information, limited resources, and no good options that wouldn't require enormous sacrifices from people who were already struggling. The crisis reached its breaking point on a morning when Kwame woke up to find a delegation of mothers waiting outside his compound, holding their obviously malnourished children and demanding immediate action to address what had become a community-wide food emergency. The build-up to this confrontation had been developing for weeks, as families had gradually exhausted their personal food reserves and begun to rely on community stores that were themselves rapidly being depleted. The key moments of this confrontation revealed the impossible position that traditional chiefs often found themselves in when facing crises that exceeded their community's resources and capabilities. The mother's spokesperson, an elderly woman named Akasua, who had known Kwame since he was a child, began the conversation with a tone that mixed desperation with barely contained anger. "Chief Kwame, our children are hungry, and we need answers. Today, not tomorrow, not next week, but today. What are you going to do to feed our families?" The dialogue that followed captured the essence of traditional leadership in crisis situations, where personal relationships intersected with formal authority in ways that created both opportunities and enormous pressure. Kwame's response had to acknowledge the legitimacy of the mother's concerns, while also managing their expectations about what solutions were actually possible given the community's resources and the broader regional situation. "Akasua, mothers of our community, I understand your fear and your anger," Kwame replied, his voice steady despite the churning anxiety in his stomach. "I have spent every day and many sleepless nights working on solutions to our food situation. We have 3 options available to us, but each one requires sacrifices and risks that we must discuss openly before making decisions that will affect all of our futures." The play-by-play of important scenes that followed illustrated the complexity of crisis management in traditional societies, where decision-making processes that normally emphasized consensus and extensive consultation had to be compressed into urgent timelines that didn't allow for the usual careful deliberation. Kwame outlined the community's options. They could implement strict rationing that would extend their current food supplies for several more weeks, while hoping for relief from neighboring communities. They could organize an expedition to distant markets where food might be available for trade, but which would require risking their remaining valuable goods. Or they could consider temporary relocation to areas where wild foods might be more abundant, but which would mean abandoning their homes and agricultural fields during a crucial season. Character motivations became clearly apparent as different community members responded to these options with varying levels of support and opposition. Families with young children strongly favored the trading expedition option, despite its risks, because they were most immediately affected by food scarcity. Older community members, particularly those who remembered previous famines, supported the rationing approach because they understood that desperation could lead to poor decisions that might make the situation worse. Young adults were more interested in the relocation option because they were physically capable of making such a move and saw it as an adventure rather than a tragedy. Unexpected developments emerged when the community's most successful trader, a man named Kofi, who had been quietly investigating regional market conditions, announced that he had discovered potential sources of grain in communities 3 days. Travel away, but the prices being demanded would require the community to trade away most of their stored wealth, including ritual objects and family heirlooms that had been accumulated over generations. The climax of the crisis came when Kwame realized that none of the available options were individually sufficient to solve the community's problems. and that survival would require combining elements from all three approaches in ways that would test every resource, relationship, and tradition the community possessed. This realization marked the moment when Kwame transitioned from trying to find the perfect solution to accepting that survival might require making imperfect decisions with uncertain outcomes. The immediate aftermath of this recognition was a moment of silence that seemed to last forever, as everyone present understood that they were facing a situation that would fundamentally change their community regardless of what decisions were made. The comfortable assumptions about traditional life, seasonal predictability, and the chief's ability to protect his people from serious harm had been shattered by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Kwame's final statement to the assembled mothers captured both the gravity of the situation and his commitment to leadership during impossible circumstances. We will do all three things because our children's lives are worth more than our comfort, our traditions, or our pride. We will ration what we have, send trading expeditions to distant markets, and prepare for possible relocation if other options fail. But we will do these things together, and we will survive this crisis together, because that is who we are as a people. The response to Kwame's crisis management plan was as complex and varied as the community itself, revealing how traditional societies handled emergency situations that required unprecedented cooperation and sacrifice. The immediate reactions ranged from relief that decisive action was finally being taken to anxiety about the risks involved in each component of the plan, with most community members experiencing conflicting emotions about choices that offered hope but demanded significant sacrifices. Various parties' reactions illustrated the different perspectives and priorities that existed within what outsiders might have assumed was a homogeneous community. Families with young children expressed cautious optimism about the trading expeditions, but worried about the safety of family members who would have to travel to distant and potentially dangerous markets. Elderly community members supported the rationing approach, but expressed concern about trading away cultural artifacts that represented connections to ancestral traditions. The immediate consequences of implementing the crisis plan included a complete reorganization of daily life in ways that affected every aspect of community functioning. Food distribution became a carefully managed process that required constant monitoring and adjustment as supplies dwindled and new sources became available. Community labor was redirected from normal seasonal activities to support the crisis response, with some people assigned to trading expeditions, others to managing rationing systems, and still others to scouting potential relocation sites. Political and social fallout from the crisis management decisions created new tensions within the community, as the stress of survival brought out both the best and worst aspects of human nature. Some families demonstrated remarkable generosity by sharing their private food reserves with neighbors, while others hoarded resources and attempted to gain advantages through private trading arrangements that undermined community solidarity. How this changed everything became apparent as traditional social patterns were disrupted by the demands of crisis survival. Normal ceremonial activities were suspended or modified to conserve resources. Traditional hospitality customs were strained by the inability to offer guests adequate food, and social hierarchies were challenged as survival skills became more important than traditional status markers. The ironic outcomes included the discovery that the crisis, despite its immediate suffering and disruption, actually strengthened some aspects of community resilience and cooperation. People developed new skills in resource management, creative problem solving, and collaborative decision-making that would prove valuable in future challenges. The shared experience of surviving together created bonds between community members that transcended previous social divisions and conflicts. However, not all outcomes were positive. Some families who suffered most severely during the crisis never fully recovered their previous economic status, creating long-term inequalities that affected community dynamics for years. Relationships with neighboring communities were permanently altered by the crisis, as mutual aid agreements revealed which groups could be counted on during emergencies and which prioritized their own survival over traditional alliance obligations. The crisis also revealed limitations in traditional leadership systems when facing challenges that exceeded local resources and capabilities. While Kwame's leadership during the crisis enhanced his reputation for decisive action under pressure, it also demonstrated that traditional chiefs needed support systems and external relationships that went beyond their immediate communities to effectively manage regional emergencies. Long-term consequences included changes in how the community approached risk management, resource storage, and emergency planning. The experience led to modifications in traditional practices around food preservation, agricultural planning, and inter-community cooperation that reflected hard-learned lessons about survival in unpredictable environments. This food crisis wasn't just a temporary emergency that tested one community's survival skills. It was a window into the fundamental challenges that traditional African societies faced when dealing with environmental uncertainties, resource limitations, and the basic human struggle to maintain social cohesion during periods of extreme stress. The deeper meaning of the crisis revealed how traditional leadership systems were simultaneously robust and fragile, capable of mobilizing extraordinary community cooperation during emergencies, but dependent on resources and circumstances that could be disrupted by factors beyond local control. Kwame's crisis management demonstrated both the strengths of traditional decision-making processes, which emphasized community consultation and consensus building, and their limitations when facing situations that required rapid action with incomplete information. What the crisis revealed about the system and society was that traditional African communities had developed sophisticated strategies for managing predictable seasonal variations and normal resource fluctuations, but were vulnerable to exceptional circumstances that exceeded their established coping mechanisms. The crisis exposed both the impressive resilience of traditional social networks and their dependence on assumptions about environmental stability and inter-community cooperation that might not hold during regional emergencies. Long-term effects of such crises included modifications in traditional practices that reflected adaptive learning from survival experiences. Communities that successfully navigated food crises often developed enhanced systems for resource storage, more diversified agricultural strategies, and stronger networks of mutual aid with distant communities that could provide assistance during local emergencies. Why historians still debate such events relates to questions about the sustainability and effectiveness of traditional resource management systems compared to modern alternatives. Some scholars argue that traditional societies were better adapted to environmental uncertainties because they had developed flexible, community-based responses to crisis situations. Others contend that traditional systems were inherently vulnerable to environmental shocks, and that modern agricultural and economic systems, despite their own problems, provide more reliable protection against food insecurity. The debate continues, because these historical examples provide insights into contemporary discussions about sustainability, community resilience, and the effectiveness of different approaches to managing environmental and economic uncertainties in an era of climate change and global economic interdependence. Around the dramatic events of crisis management and daily dispute resolution, colorful cast of supporting characters played crucial roles that would make a modern department either very impressed or very concerned, depending on how you feel about workplace boundaries and the concept of work-life balance. These weren't just background figures who occasionally wandered through the chief's daily routine. They were integral players whose personalities, skills, and occasional complete lack of common sense shaped every aspect of community life in ways that were both essential and entertainingly chaotic. Armar the Elder was Kwame's primary advisor, and the closest thing the community had to a walking encyclopedia of traditional law, family genealogies, and embarrassing stories about everyone's ancestors that could be weaponized during disputes when diplomatic solutions weren't working. She was roughly 70 years old, had survived 3 different chiefs, and possessed the rare combination of genuine wisdom and absolutely no patience for nonsense that made her simultaneously invaluable and terrifying. Armagh represented the institutional memory of the community, but she also had a tendency to begin every piece of advice with detailed historical context that could turn a simple yes or no question into a 3-hour lecture about events that happened before anyone currently alive was born. Her significance lay in her ability to provide historical perspective on current problems, but her stories often included tangents about long-dead relatives that made important points while testing everyone's attention span. Kofi the trader served as the community's primary connection to the outside world and their main source of information about market conditions, political developments in neighboring areas, and really excellent gossip about what was happening in communities just far enough away to be interesting, but not so far as to be irrelevant. Kofi represented a different aspect of traditional society, the mobile, entrepreneurial element that maintained networks across multiple communities and brought back both valuable goods and valuable information from his travels. His story included adventures in distant markets, where he had learned to negotiate with people who spoke different languages, followed different customs, and occasionally tried to cheat him in creative ways that actually impressed him professionally. Kofi's contribution to the narrative was his role as both problem solver and problem creator, because his trading expeditions sometimes solved resource shortages, but also sometimes brought back news about regional conflicts, disease outbreaks, or political changes that created new challenges for community leadership. Nana, the spiritual advisor, brought yet another dimension to the chief's support network, serving as the primary intermediary between the community and the ancestral spirits who were theoretically providing guidance, but who communicated in ways that required considerable interpretation and occasionally seemed to have their own agenda that didn't always align with practical problem-solving needs. Nana was responsible for conducting the rituals, interpreting omens, and providing spiritual counsel that helped community members make sense of their experiences within traditional religious frameworks. Her role was crucial because spiritual well-being was considered inseparable from physical and social well-being, but it was also complicated because spiritual guidance sometimes conflicted with practical necessities in ways that required diplomatic balance between honoring traditions and dealing with immediate realities. Nana's personal story included her own calling to spiritual service, which had involved traumatic visions, extensive training with previous spiritual leaders, and the ongoing challenge of maintaining credibility while dealing with community members who expected her to provide supernatural solutions to natural problems. These weren't isolated individuals operating independently. They formed an informal but essential support network that enabled traditional chiefs to function effectively while managing responsibilities that would overwhelm any single person attempting to handle them alone. The relationships between these supporting characters created additional layers of complexity in community dynamics, because they each had their own personalities, priorities, and occasional conflicts with each other that Kwame had to navigate while relying on their expertise and assistance. These supporting characters weren't just individual advisors who showed up when needed. Their stories were interwoven in ways that created a complex web of relationships, dependencies, and occasional dramatic conflicts that made community life resemble a combination of political intrigue and family reunion dynamics, with all the benefits and complications that such arrangements typically involve. How their stories connected became apparent during situations that required coordination between different aspects of community leadership. For example, when Kofi returned from trading expeditions with information about political changes in neighboring areas, his reports had to be evaluated by Armagh for their implications under traditional law, interpreted by Nana for their spiritual significance and synthesized by Kwame into decisions that addressed practical, legal, and spiritual concerns simultaneously. This process created opportunities for disagreement between advisors who might interpret the same information differently based on their areas of expertise and personal perspectives. The webs of relationships between supporting characters included both professional collaboration and personal friendships that complicated their roles in community leadership. Ama and Nana had known each other for decades and had developed a working relationship that included both mutual respect and occasional professional rivalry about whose advice carried more weight in specific situations. Kofi's relationships with both women were more recent, but complicated by the fact that his trading activities sometimes brought him into contact with spiritual practices and legal traditions from other communities that challenged local assumptions about the correct ways of doing things. Political and social networks created additional layers of complexity because each supporting character maintained their own relationships within the community that could influence their advice to the chief. Ama's extended family included some of the community's most prominent members, which meant her counsel sometimes reflected family interests as well as traditional law. Nana's position as spiritual advisor gave her influence with community members who sought her guidance on personal matters, creating informal networks of loyalty that could affect how her advice was received. Kofi's trading relationships created economic dependencies and opportunities that influenced his perspective on community decisions affecting trade, resource allocation, and relationships with neighboring groups. How one event led to another through these interconnected relationships became clear during the food crisis, when the need for coordinated action revealed both the strengths and limitations of the advisory system. Ama's knowledge of traditional approaches to famine management provided historical context for decision-making, but her commitment to establish precedents sometimes conflicted with innovative solutions that circumstances seemed to require. Nana's spiritual guidance helped maintain community morale during the crisis, but her emphasis on traditional ceremonies consumed resources that might have been used for more practical survival activities. Kofi's trading networks provided access to external food sources, but his commercial relationships sometimes conflicted with traditional expectations about community solidarity and resource sharing. Unintended consequences of these interconnected relationships included situations where supporting characters' personal dynamics affected their professional collaboration in ways that complicated Kwame's leadership responsibilities. When Ama and Nana disagreed about the spiritual implications of trading away traditional artifacts during the food crisis, their conflict created factions within the community that supported different approaches to balancing traditional values against survival necessities. Kofi's relationships with traders from other communities sometimes brought him information about economic opportunities that could benefit individuals, but might undermine community solidarity if not carefully managed. The connections between these stories revealed how traditional African societies maintained stability through multiple overlapping relationships and support systems, but also how these same systems could create complications when different priorities and perspectives came into conflict. The supporting characters' interconnected roles demonstrated that effective traditional leadership required not just individual wisdom and authority, but also the ability to manage complex social networks and coordinate diverse expertise in ways that served community interests while respecting individual relationships and traditional roles. To understand the roles and relationships of these supporting characters, you have to understand the cultural elements that shape daily life in traditional African societies, where personal relationships, professional responsibilities, and spiritual obligations were interwoven in ways that made modern concepts of work-life balance completely irrelevant and probably incomprehensible to people whose entire existence was built around community integration. Daily life in Kwame's community was structured around collective activities that required constant coordination and cooperation between individuals who filled multiple roles simultaneously. Amma wasn't just an advisor. She was also a grandmother, a keeper of traditional crafts, a participant in women's organizations, and a source of informal counseling for community members dealing with personal problems. Her advice to Kwame was influenced by all of these roles and relationships, making her counsel both comprehensive and complicated. The beliefs and attitudes that shaped these cultural patterns included concepts of collective responsibility that made individual success inseparable from community welfare. Co-fish trading activities were understood not just as personal economic ventures, but as contributions to community prosperity that carried obligations to share both profits and opportunities with other community members. His relationships with external trading partners were evaluated not just for their commercial value, but for their implications for community security, cultural preservation, and social harmony. Social structures in traditional societies created expectations about how different types of people should interact with each other and what obligations they owed to various categories of community members. Nana's role as spiritual advisor included responsibilities not just for conducting ceremonies and providing guidance, but also for maintaining the community's connection to traditional values and practices that define their identity as a distinct cultural group. Her position carried both privileges and restrictions that affected how she could participate in community life and how others could interact with her. What was considered normal versus exceptional in these cultural contexts differed significantly from modern assumptions about individual autonomy and professional specialization. Normal life included extensive consultation between community members about decisions that modern societies would consider purely personal matters, such as marriage, choices, occupational activities, and resource management strategies. Exceptional circumstances, such as the food crisis, intensified these consultation processes rather than suspending them, creating opportunities for both enhanced cooperation and increased conflict. How this cultural context shaped events becomes clear when you realize that every decision Kwame made had to account not just for practical outcomes, but also for how those decisions would affect the complex web of relationships, obligations, and expectations that held the community together. The supporting characters weren't just advisors providing technical expertise. They were representatives of different aspects of community life, whose perspectives had to be balanced and integrated to maintain social cohesion while addressing immediate challenges. Modern parallels to these cultural patterns can be found in close-knit communities where personal and professional relationships overlap extensively. But traditional African societies took this integration to levels that would be challenging for most contemporary people to navigate successfully. Perhaps most amusing was the contradiction between the idealized image of traditional African societies as harmonious, consensus-based communities and the reality of daily life in Kwame's village, where maintaining harmony required constant negotiation between people who had been arguing with each other about the same issues for decades and who brought family grudges dating back multiple generations into every community discussion. Examples of contradictions included the gap between the reverence shown to traditional wisdom and the practical reality that traditional solutions didn't always work for contemporary problems. Amma's encyclopedic knowledge of historical precedents was invaluable for understanding how previous generations had handled similar challenges, but some of those precedents involved circumstances that no longer existed or solutions that were no longer practical given changed environmental or social conditions. The community needed traditional wisdom, but also needed innovation, creating ongoing tension between respecting established practices and adapting to new realities. How things weren't what they seemed became apparent in the relationships between supporting characters, where public displays of unity and cooperation masked ongoing professional rivalries and personal conflicts that occasionally erupted into dramatic confrontations during community meetings. Amma and Nana's respectful collaboration included subtle competitions about whose advice was more valuable, whose interpretation of traditional practices was more accurate, and whose influence with Kwame was more significant. Modern parallels too. These contradictions include the challenges that contemporary organizations face when trying to balance respect for institutional traditions with the need for innovation and adaptation. The tension between honoring established expertise and incorporating new perspectives remains a constant challenge in both traditional and modern societies, suggesting that some human dynamics transcend specific cultural contexts. The ironic situation of chiefs who were supposed to have ultimate authority, but who actually had to negotiate every decision with multiple advisors, community members, and spiritual entities demonstrates that traditional African leadership systems were simultaneously more democratic and more complicated than either their supporters or critics typically acknowledge. The contradictions reveal the complexity of human societies that resist simple categorization as either egalitarian or hierarchical, traditional or innovative, harmonious or conflicted. Everything changed when a delegation of colonial administrators arrived at Kwame's community with the kind of bureaucratic confidence that only comes from people who have never actually tried to manage a traditional African society, but are absolutely certain they can do it better than people who have been successfully doing it for centuries. The background to this change was the expanding colonial presence in the region, which had been gradually working its way inland from coastal trading posts with the systematic efficiency of a really persistent rash. Why this moment was different from previous encounters with outsiders became clear when the colonial delegation announced that they weren't just passing through or seeking trading relationships, but were there to establish permanent administrative control over the region in the name of bringing civilization, order, and proper governance to communities that had somehow managed to survive and thrive without European assistance for several thousand years. It was like having someone show up at your house, announce that they're moving in permanently, and then explain that they're doing you a favor because your housekeeping doesn't meet their standards. Key factors that led to this transformation included the European scramble for African territories, which had accelerated to the point where colonial powers were claiming regions they had never visited based on maps drawn by people who had never been there either. The local manifestation of this broader imperial competition was the arrival of administrators who carried official documents establishing colonial authority over territories that included Kwame's community, whether the community wanted to be administered or not. The immediate trigger for change was the colonial delegation's demand that Kwame acknowledge their authority and agree to implement new administrative systems that would replace traditional governance structures with colonial bureaucracy. This wasn't presented as a negotiation or a request for cooperation. It was delivered as a non-negotiable requirement that had already been decided by officials in distant colonial capitals who had probably never heard of Kwame's community before drawing lines on maps that divided it into administrative units. What made this encounter particularly surreal was the colonial administrators' apparent belief that they were offering Kwame an opportunity to participate in a superior form of governance, rather than demanding that he abandon systems that had been working effectively for his community for generations. They presented their requirements with the kind of enthusiasm that people usually reserve for announcing surprise parties or lottery winnings, completely oblivious to the fact that their audience was not sharing their excitement about the proposed changes. The colonial delegation included a district commissioner who spoke with the authority of someone who had been told he was in charge, but clearly had no idea what he was supposed to be in charge of. A military escort that suggested the civilizing mission might involve violence if cooperation wasn't forthcoming, and a clerk whose job seemed to involve writing down everything that was said in case anyone later needed evidence of what had been agreed to, whether agreement had actually occurred or not. Kwame found himself facing a situation that none of his traditional training, spiritual preparation, or advisory consultations had prepared him for. how to respond to people who claimed ultimate authority over his community, but who demonstrated no understanding of how the community actually functioned or what its needs and priorities actually were. How the change unfolded resembled a slow-motion collision between two completely different approaches to organization, authority, and community management, with results that were simultaneously predictable and completely chaotic. The colonial administrators had arrived with detailed plans for implementing their administrative systems, but their plans were based on assumptions about African societies that bore little resemblance to the actual complexity of traditional governance structures. Resistance to change came from multiple sources within the community, but not always in the ways that colonial officials expected or understood. Some community members opposed any collaboration with colonial authority on principle, viewing the entire colonial enterprise as an illegitimate intrusion that should be rejected regardless of the consequences. Others were willing to consider cooperation if it could be negotiated in ways that preserved essential aspects of traditional governance while accommodating colonial requirements. Still others saw potential opportunities in the new system that might benefit their families or their positions within the community. Champions of change included a few community members who had previous contact with colonial systems through trading relationships or employment in coastal areas, and who believed that adaptation to colonial requirements was inevitable and potentially beneficial if handled skillfully. These advocates argued that resistance would only lead to more intrusive colonial intervention, while strategic cooperation might allow the community to maintain some degree of autonomy while gaining access to colonial resources and opportunities. The specific steps and stages of implementing change revealed the fundamental incompatibility between colonial administrative systems and traditional African governance structures. Colonial officials wanted to establish clear hierarchical authority, with written laws, defined jurisdictions, and standardized procedures that could be uniformly applied across different communities. Traditional systems relied on personalized relationships, oral traditions, and flexible procedures that were adapted to specific circumstances and local conditions. Obstacles encountered during the transition process included the colonial administrators' inability to understand why community decisions required extensive consultation with elders, spiritual advisors, and family representatives, which they viewed as inefficient bureaucracy that slowed down proper administration. Meanwhile, community members couldn't understand why colonial officials insisted on making decisions without consulting the people who would be affected by those decisions, which seemed like a recipe for creating problems that could have been avoided through proper consultation. Breakthrough moments occurred when both sides began to realize that some form of hybrid system might be necessary to make colonial administration function without completely destroying traditional community structures. Kwame found himself serving as a translator between two different approaches to governance, trying to explain colonial requirements to community members while also trying to explain community realities to colonial officials who had been trained to implement standardized systems regardless of local conditions. The role of individuals versus larger forces became apparent as the change process revealed how personal relationships and individual decisions could influence broader historical transformations. Kwame's personal approach to managing the transition affected not just his own community, but also how neighboring communities responded to similar colonial pressures. His decisions about cooperation, resistance, and negotiation created precedents that influenced regional patterns of colonial administration. Colonial officials also found themselves adapting their standard procedures to accommodate realities they hadn't anticipated when their administrative plans were developed in distant colonial offices. The district commissioner discovered that implementing colonial law required understanding traditional law, that collecting taxes required understanding traditional economic systems, and that maintaining order required understanding traditional social relationships. The process revealed the limitations of both traditional and colonial systems, When applied to circumstances they weren't designed to handle. Traditional governance structures were effective for managing communities where everyone shared cultural assumptions and personal relationships, but were challenged by the need to interact with colonial systems that operated according to completely different principles. Colonial systems were designed for territorial administration and resource extraction, but were poorly suited for managing the complex social relationships and cultural practices that held traditional communities together. Unintended consequences of the change process included the development of new forms of authority that combined elements from both traditional and colonial systems in ways that neither side had originally intended. Kwame found himself exercising authority that was simultaneously traditional and colonial, responsible to both community members and colonial officials, and required to balance competing demands that sometimes couldn't be reconciled. The adaptation process also created new opportunities for some community members while limiting opportunities for others, leading to changes in social relationships and economic patterns that extended far beyond the immediate political changes that colonial administration was intended to implement. Young men who learned to navigate colonial bureaucracy get new forms of influence, while traditional authorities who couldn't adapt to colonial requirements lost some of their previous standing within the community. The new system that emerged from this collision of traditional and colonial governance resembled nothing that either side had originally envisioned, creating a hybrid arrangement that satisfied no one completely, but somehow managed to function in ways that allowed both colonial officials and community members to claim partial success, while privately acknowledging that the whole situation was much more complicated than anyone had expected. How things were different became apparent in the daily routine of community leadership, which now required Kwame to maintain two parallel sets of responsibilities that sometimes complemented each other and sometimes created impossible conflicts. He still needed to fulfill traditional obligations to mediate disputes, organize community activities, and maintain spiritual practices, but he also had to satisfy colonial requirements for tax collection, legal compliance, and administrative reporting that often conflicted with traditional approaches to these same issues. Who won and who lost in this new arrangement depended largely on how successfully different community members adapted to the hybrid system, and whether they could navigate both traditional and colonial sources of authority. Some individuals who had previously held marginal positions in traditional society gained influence by becoming intermediaries between the community and colonial administration. Others who had held traditional authority found their influence diminished if they couldn't adapt to colonial requirements or if their traditional roles conflicted with colonial administrative needs. The new rules and norms that emerged from this transition created a complex system where community members had to understand both traditional expectations and colonial regulations, often switching between different behavioral codes depending on whether they were dealing with traditional or colonial authority. This created opportunities for people who were skilled at code switching, but also created stress and confusion for those who struggled to keep track of which rules applied in which situations. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically revealed the resilience of some traditional practices and the vulnerability of others to colonial disruption. Family relationships, spiritual practices, and local economic activities often continued with minimal colonial interference, while political decision-making, legal procedures, and inter-community relationships were significantly altered by colonial requirements. The selective preservation of traditional practices created a patchwork system where some aspects of community life remained largely unchanged, while others were completely transformed. The economic dimensions of the new reality included the introduction of colonial taxation systems that required communities to generate cash income, and with them relying entirely on traditional subsistence and barter systems. This forced changes in agricultural practices, labor organization, and trading relationships that had cascading effects throughout traditional economic systems. Some community members benefited from new economic opportunities created by colonial demand for cash crops and wage labor, while others struggled to adapt to economic requirements that conflicted with traditional approaches to work and resource sharing. Social relationships were affected by the new system in ways that created both opportunities and tensions within the community. Colonial education systems provided some young people with skills and knowledge that created new possibilities for economic advancement, but also created cultural gaps between generations that had different relationships to traditional and colonial knowledge systems. The introduction of colonial legal systems created new forms of individual rights and responsibilities that sometimes conflicted with traditional approaches to collective decision-making and community obligations. The hybrid system that emerged was neither fully traditional nor fully colonial, but rather a unique adaptation that reflected the specific circumstances of Kwame's community and the particular colonial officials who implemented administrative changes. This meant that different communities in the region developed different approaches to managing the transition, creating a diverse landscape of hybrid governance systems, rather than the uniform administrative structure that colonial planners had originally envisioned. Was this change beneficial or harmful to Kwame's community? The answer depends entirely on your perspective, your values, and whether you judge success by survival, prosperity, cultural preservation, or adaptation to changing circumstances, which means that different people could look at exactly the same outcomes and reach completely opposite conclusions about whether the colonial transition represented progress or catastrophe. Different perspectives on the colonial transition reflected different priorities and experiences within the community. Community members who gained new opportunities through colonial systems, such as young people who received Western education or individuals who succeeded in colonial economic activities, often viewed the changes more positively than those who lost traditional authority or struggled to adapt to new requirements. Colonial officials evaluated success based on administrative efficiency and resource extraction, while community members were more concerned with maintaining social relationships and cultural practices. Short-term versus long-term effects created additional complexity in evaluating the colonial transition. Some changes that initially seemed beneficial, such as access to Western medical care or educational opportunities, had long-term consequences that included cultural disruption and dependency on colonial systems. Other changes that initially seemed harmful, such as the disruption of traditional political authority, sometimes led to adaptive innovations that strengthened community resilience in unexpected ways. Unintended consequences of the colonial transition included the development of new forms of African leadership that combined traditional legitimacy with colonial administrative skills, creating possibilities for future independence movements that colonial officials had never intended to facilitate. The hybrid systems that emerged during the colonial period often provided foundations for post-colonial governance structures that drew on both traditional and modern administrative approaches. Modern judgment versus contemporary views reveals how historical evaluations of colonialism have changed as scholars have gained better understanding of traditional African societies, and as African voices have become more prominent in historical discussions. Contemporary colonial officials generally viewed their activities as beneficial modernization, while modern historians are more likely to recognize both the damage caused by colonial disruption and the agency that African communities demonstrated. In adapting to colonial pressures, the complexity of evaluating historical change reflects the reality that major transformations typically create both opportunities and losses, making simple judgments about progress or decline inadequate for understanding the full implications of historical transitions that affected different people in different ways. In the years that followed the initial colonial intrusion, Kwame's community developed what could only be described as a sophisticated strategy of selective compliance that would make modern corporate managers weep with envy at its combination of apparent cooperation and subtle resistance. How things developed after the colonial transition resembled a long-term chess game, where both sides were playing by different rules, using different pieces, and occasionally moving the board when the other side wasn't looking. New challenges emerged as the colonial administration became more systematic and demanding in its requirements, moving beyond the initial establishment of authority to implement comprehensive systems for taxation, labor recruitment, agricultural regulation, and social control that affected every aspect of traditional life. What had initially seemed like a manageable accommodation to colonial presence gradually expanded into a comprehensive transformation of community life that required constant adaptation and negotiation. Evolution of the situation included the development of informal networks between traditional leaders in different communities who shared strategies for managing colonial requirements while preserving essential aspects of traditional governance. Kwame found himself participating in a regional underground of chiefs who met secretly to coordinate their responses to colonial policies, share information about effective resistance strategies, and provide mutual support for leaders who were struggling to balance traditional obligations with colonial demands. Second-generation effects of the colonial transition became apparent as young people who had grown up under the hybrid system began to assume leadership roles within the community. These emerging leaders had different relationships to both traditional and colonial authority than their parents' generation, creating new possibilities for adaptation, but also new sources of tension as different generations disagreed about the proper balance between accommodation and resistance. The colonial administration also evolved in response to African resistance and adaptation, developing more sophisticated strategies for control that recognized the limitations of direct confrontation. With traditional authority, colonial officials learned to work through traditional leaders rather than replacing them entirely, creating systems of indirect rule that maintain the appearance of traditional governance, while ensuring colonial control over key decisions and resources. Economic transformations accelerated as colonial demands for cash crops and wage labor integrated traditional communities into global economic systems in ways that created both opportunities and dependencies. Some community members prospered by adapting traditional agricultural and trading skills to colonial economic requirements, while others found themselves trapped in economic relationships that provided survival but not prosperity. Cultural changes occurred more gradually but were equally significant as colonial education systems, religious missions, and administrative practices introduced new ideas about individual rights, social organization, and cultural values that sometimes conflicted with traditional beliefs and practices. The community had to navigate between preserving cultural identity and adapting to changing circumstances that made some traditional practices difficult or impossible to maintain. The long-term pattern that emerged was one of continuous negotiation and adaptation, as both traditional and colonial systems modified their approaches in response to the practical challenges of governing complex societies that included multiple and sometimes competing sources of authority, legitimacy, and social organization. The colonial period introduced a cast of new characters who would have been completely foreign to previous generations, but who became essential players in the evolving drama of community life under colonial rule. These new figures brought different skills, perspectives, and loyalties that complicated traditional social relationships, while creating new possibilities for leadership and influence within the community. The colonial-educated elites represented the most significant new category of community leadership, consisting of young people who had attended mission schools or colonial educational institutions and returned to their communities with literacy skills, knowledge of colonial administrative systems, and ideas about social organization that sometimes complemented and sometimes challenged traditional approaches. These individuals often became intermediaries between traditional and colonial authority, translating between different cultural and administrative systems while trying to advance both community interests and their own careers within the colonial system. How they differed from earlier players became apparent in their approach to problem solving, which combined traditional consultation processes with colonial bureaucratic procedures in ways that created new hybrid forms of leadership. Unlike traditional leaders who derived authority from family lineage, spiritual calling, or community selection, colonial educated leaders had to establish legitimacy through demonstrated competence in navigating both traditional and colonial systems. Their contributions included bringing new technical skills and knowledge to community problem solving, such as literacy, accounting, and legal knowledge that enabled more effective interaction with colonial administrative systems. They also served as cultural translators who helped community members understand colonial requirements and helped colonial officials understand community realities, reducing some of the misunderstandings that had characterized earlier colonial community interactions. However, their presence also created disruptions in traditional social hierarchies and decision-making processes. Some colonial-educated individuals developed attitudes that were perceived as disrespectful toward traditional authority and cultural practices, creating generational and ideological conflicts within communities that were already struggling to adapt to colonial pressures. Colonial administrators themselves evolved as they gained experience with African societies, moving from the initial ignorance and arrogance that characterized early colonial encounters to more sophisticated strategies that recognized the complexity of traditional governance systems. Some colonial officials developed genuine appreciation for traditional African institutions and worked to create administrative systems that accommodated rather than destroyed traditional practices. Missionary influences introduced another category of new players who brought religious ideas, educational opportunities, and medical services that some community members welcomed, while others viewed with suspicion. Missionaries often served as advocates for African interests within colonial systems, but they also promoted cultural changes that challenged traditional spiritual practices and social organization. Economic intermediaries, including traders, labor recruiters, and agricultural extension agents, created new networks that connected traditional communities to global economic systems. These figures often provided opportunities for economic advancement, but also created dependencies and vulnerabilities that affected community autonomy and traditional economic practices. The specific stories about these new elements revealed how individual personalities and relationships shaped broader historical processes. Some colonial-educated individuals became effective advocates for their communities within colonial systems, while others prioritized personal advancement over community interests. Some colonial officials became sensitive to traditional concerns and worked to minimize colonial disruption, while others remained focused primarily on administrative efficiency and resource extraction. The interactions between these new players and traditional community members created complex dynamics that influenced everything from daily administrative procedures to long-term strategies for cultural preservation and adaptation. The success or failure of community adaptation to colonial rule often depended on the quality of relationships between traditional leaders like Kwame and the new categories of intermediaries who emerged during the colonial period. But some problems persisted despite all the adaptive strategies, bureaucratic innovations, and diplomatic maneuvering that characterized the colonial period, proving that certain fundamental conflicts between traditional and colonial systems were not easily resolved through compromise or creative administration. These continuing challenges revealed the deeper structural incompatibilities between different approaches to governance, social organization, and cultural values that went beyond surface-level administrative arrangements. Continuing challenges included the persistent tension between traditional collective decision-making processes and colonial demands for individual authority and responsibility. Colonial systems required clear hierarchical relationships with identifiable leaders who could be held accountable for administrative compliance, while traditional systems distributed authority among multiple individuals and institutions in ways that made colonial accountability requirements difficult to satisfy without fundamentally altering traditional governance structures. What didn't get resolved was the fundamental question of legitimacy and authority in communities that were subject to both traditional and colonial governance systems. Community members often found themselves navigating conflicting demands from traditional leaders who derived authority from customary law and community selection, and colonial officials who claimed authority based on territorial jurisdiction and administrative appointment. This dual authority structure created ongoing confusion about which rules applied in which situations and which leaders had the right to make binding decisions. New versions of old problems emerged as traditional conflicts adapted to colonial contexts in ways that made them more complex and potentially more destructive. Property disputes that had previously been resolved through traditional mediation processes now involved colonial legal systems that operated according to different principles and procedures. Marriage negotiations that had traditionally involved extended family networks now had to account for colonial regulations about individual rights and legal procedures that sometimes conflicted with traditional practices. Cyclical patterns developed as communities oscillated between periods of accommodation to colonial requirements and periods of resistance to colonial control, often in response to changing colonial policies or varying levels of colonial administrative pressure. Communities that had successfully adapted to initial colonial requirements sometimes found themselves struggling to adapt to new colonial demands that exceeded their capacity for accommodation without fundamental cultural change. Why certain issues proved intractable relates to the fundamental differences between traditional African concepts of social organization, which emphasized collective responsibility and flexible adaptation to changing circumstances, and colonial administrative concepts, which emphasized standardized procedures and individual accountability. These philosophical differences couldn't be resolved through practical compromises because they represented incompatible approaches to basic questions about authority, responsibility, and social organization. Economic problems proved particularly resistant to resolution because colonial economic systems required communities to participate in global markets while maintaining traditional subsistence practices, creating economic pressures that often forced impossible choices between cultural preservation and economic survival. Traditional economic systems that had emphasized reciprocity and resource sharing were challenged by colonial systems that emphasized individual accumulation and market competition. Cultural conflicts persisted as communities struggled to maintain traditional practices while adapting to colonial requirements that sometimes directly contradicted traditional values and beliefs. Educational systems that promoted individual achievements and Western cultural values challenged traditional approaches to knowledge transmission and social responsibility. Religious missions that promoted individual salvation and Western moral codes challenged traditional spiritual practices and community-based approaches to ethical behavior. The ongoing nature of these problems reflected the reality that the colonial period represented not just an administrative transition, but a fundamental challenge to traditional ways of understanding social relationships, cultural identity, and community organization that continued to generate tensions and conflicts throughout the colonial period and beyond, compared to earlier periods in the community's history, when external challenges had been manageable through traditional adaptation strategies. The colonial period represented a qualitatively different type of challenge that required responses that went beyond the capacity of traditional institutions, while remaining within the cultural boundaries that defined community identity. The analysis reveals both the remarkable adaptability of traditional African societies and the limits of that adaptability when facing sustained pressure from systems that operated according to fundamentally different principles. What was unique about the colonial challenge was its systematic and comprehensive nature, which affected every aspect of community life, other than focusing on specific issues that could be addressed through traditional problem-solving approaches. Previous challenges, such as environmental crises, inter-community conflicts, or economic disruptions, had required adaptation within familiar cultural frameworks, while colonial challenges required communities to develop entirely new frameworks for understanding authority, social organization, and cultural identity. What was universal about the colonial experience was the fundamental human struggle to maintain cultural identity while adapting to changing circumstances that threaten traditional ways of life. This challenge has been faced by communities throughout history when confronted with more powerful societies that demanded fundamental changes in traditional practices, suggesting that the African colonial experience reflects broader patterns of cultural contact and adaptation other than unique circumstances specific to African societies. Lessons that could be learned from the colonial period include the importance of maintaining cultural flexibility while preserving core values, the necessity of developing leadership skills that can navigate multiple cultural systems simultaneously, and the value of maintaining strong community networks that can provide support during periods of rapid social change. The colonial experience also demonstrated the importance of understanding how external systems operate in order to interact with them effectively while maintaining community autonomy. Patterns that repeated elsewhere can be seen in other colonial contexts where indigenous societies developed similar strategies of selective accommodation and resistance, suggesting that the approaches developed by communities like Kwame's represented rational responses to colonial pressure rather than unique cultural adaptations. The development of hybrid governance systems, the emergence of educated intermediaries, and the persistence of traditional practices alongside colonial requirements occurred throughout the colonial world. Modern relevance of these historical patterns can be seen in contemporary situations where communities face pressure to adapt to globalization, modernization, or integration into larger political and economic systems while maintaining cultural identity and community autonomy. The strategies developed during the colonial period for balancing accommodation with resistance, for maintaining traditional practices while adapting to new requirements, and for developing leadership that can navigate multiple cultural systems, remain relevant for communities facing similar challenges in the contemporary world. The comparative analysis suggests that the colonial period in African history represents both a unique historical experience and a particular example of universal human challenges related to cultural adaptation, community survival, and the maintenance of identity under pressure from more powerful external forces. By the later colonial period, signs pointed to a fundamental transformation in the nature of traditional leadership that would make Kwame's original role as community chief seem as outdated as trying to run a modern corporation in stone tablets and carrier pigeons. Warning signs appeared gradually, like symptoms of a chronic illness that nobody wanted to acknowledge until the patient was already in critical condition. What key players could see versus what they missed created a tragic irony that would have been comedic if it weren't so devastating to communities that had invested centuries in developing effective governance systems. Kwame and other traditional leaders could clearly observe the increasing marginalization of their authority as colonial administrators took direct control over decisions that had previously been community prerogatives. They watched as young people increasingly sought opportunities in colonial institutions rather than traditional apprenticeships, as community members turned to colonial courts rather than traditional mediation for dispute resolution, and as economic activities shifted toward colonial requirements rather than traditional practices. However, what many traditional leaders missed was the extent to which these changes represented permanent transformations rather than temporary adjustments that, could be reversed once colonial pressure subsided. The assumption that traditional systems could be preserved alongside colonial requirements underestimated the fundamental incompatibility between the two approaches to social organization and the extent to which participation in colonial systems would gradually undermine the cultural foundations that supported traditional authority. Resistance to inevitable change took various forms, from direct confrontation with colonial authority to more subtle strategies of cultural preservation that attempted to maintain traditional practices within colonial frameworks. Some chiefs attempted to reassert traditional authority by emphasizing spiritual and cultural roles that seemed less directly threatened by colonial administrative control. Others tried to demonstrate the continuing relevance of traditional governance by developing more efficient approaches to community problem solving that could compete with colonial administrative systems. The most poignant form of resistance was the attempt by traditional leaders to prepare younger generations to serve as cultural custodians who could preserve traditional knowledge and practices even if they couldn't maintain traditional political authority. This involved intensive efforts to transmit oral histories, traditional laws, and cultural practices to young people who were simultaneously being educated in colonial schools that taught them to view traditional knowledge as primitive and irrelevant. Colonial authorities, meanwhile, were developing increasingly sophisticated strategies for eliminating traditional authority without creating the kind of direct confrontation that might provoke organized resistance. Rather than simply abolishing traditional leadership, colonial administrators gradually reduced the scope of traditional authority while increasing the requirements for colonial compliance, creating a situation where traditional leaders became administrative assistants rather than community leaders. The economic dimensions of this transformation were particularly devastating, as colonial economic policies systematically undermined the material foundations that had supported traditional leadership. Traditional chiefs had derived authority partly from their role in managing community resources and organizing economic activities, but colonial taxation, labor recruitment, and agricultural policies transferred control over these functions to colonial administrators, leaving traditional leaders with ceremonial roles but little practical authority. The psychological impact on traditional leaders, like Kwame, was profound, as they watched institutions and practices that had defined their identities and purposes gradually become irrelevant or actively discouraged by colonial policies that offered no meaningful alternative roles for people whose entire lives had been devoted to traditional forms of community service. The final phase of traditional chiefly authority didn't end with dramatic confrontations or heroic last stands, but rather faded away with the quiet desperation of someone trying to maintain dignity while watching everything they had devoted their lives to becoming irrelevant. How the era ended resembled the slow deflation of a balloon rather than the dramatic crash of a collapsing building, making it somehow more tragic because there was no specific moment when anyone could say that traditional leadership had officially died. Specific events that marked the transition included the implementation of colonial administrative reforms that formally transferred traditional chiefly functions to appointed colonial officials, the establishment of colonial courts that assumed jurisdiction over cases that had previously been handled through traditional mediation, and the introduction of colonial taxation systems that required communities to generate cash income through participation in colonial economic activities rather than traditional subsistence practices. Final major players in this transition included the last generation of traditional chiefs who had grown up under traditional systems but spent their adult lives navigating colonial requirements, and the first generation of colonial-educated Africans who would eventually lead independence movements, but who often had complicated relationships with traditional authority that they viewed as both culturally important and politically problematic. Kwame found himself in the impossible position of trying to maintain traditional authority while acknowledging that the social and economic foundations that had supported that authority no longer existed. His daily routine, which had once involved complex responsibilities for community welfare, dispute resolution, and cultural preservation, gradually shifted toward ceremonial functions and symbolic leadership that commanded respect but carried little practical power. Last attempts to preserve traditional authority included efforts to document traditional laws and practices in written form that could be preserved even if oral transmission was interrupted. Attempts to negotiate with colonial officials for recognition of traditional leadership within colonial administrative structures, and strategies for maintaining traditional cultural practices even when traditional political authority was no longer viable. The dramatic final moments of traditional authority varied from community to community, but often involved confrontations between traditional leaders and colonial officials over specific issues that crystallized the fundamental conflicts between traditional and colonial approaches to governance. In some cases, these confrontations resulted in the arrest or exile of traditional leaders who refused to accept colonial limitations on their authority. In other cases, traditional leaders chose to step down rather than continue serving in roles that had been stripped of meaningful authority. The gradual decline was perhaps more common than dramatic confrontation, as traditional leaders found themselves increasingly irrelevant to community decision-making processes that had shifted toward colonial administrative channels. Young people stopped seeking traditional leadership guidance. Community members stopped bringing disputes to traditional mediation, and economic activities increasingly operated according to colonial requirements rather than traditional practices. Symbolic endpoints included moments when traditional leaders officially acknowledged colonial authority, when traditional ceremonies were modified or abandoned to conform with colonial requirements, or when community members stopped recognizing traditional leadership claims in favor of colonial administrative authority. These symbolic moments often carried enormous emotional weight for people who understood that they were witnessing the end of cultural traditions that had been maintained for centuries. The transition was particularly painful because it often involved people who genuinely respected traditional authority but felt compelled to prioritize colonial requirements because of practical necessities related to survival, economic opportunity, or legal compliance. Traditional leaders, like Kwame, found themselves abandoned not by people who rejected traditional values, but by people who could no longer afford to maintain traditional practices under colonial conditions. The final irony was that many of the skills and values that had made traditional leaders effective, such as consensus building, cultural sensitivity, and long-term community planning, were exactly what colonial administrative systems couldn't provide. But colonial systems were structured in ways that made it impossible to incorporate traditional leadership approaches without fundamental changes that colonial officials were unwilling to consider. The end result was the loss of governance systems that had been remarkably effective at maintaining community welfare and social stability, replaced by colonial systems that were efficient at resource extraction and administrative control but often failed to address the social and cultural needs that traditional leadership had successfully managed for generations. The analysis of why traditional chiefly authority ended reveals a complex combination of external pressure, internal adaptation challenges, and fundamental structural incompatibilities that made the preservation of traditional governance systems increasingly difficult and eventually impossible under colonial conditions. Understanding these causes helps explain just what happened to traditional leadership, but also why alternative outcomes were unlikely given the systematic nature of colonial transformation. Internal problems that contributed to the decline of traditional authority included the difficulty that traditional leaders faced in adapting to colonial requirements without fundamentally compromising the cultural and social foundations that legitimized their leadership. Traditional chiefs derived authority from their embodiment of cultural values, their role in maintaining traditional practices, and their effectiveness at managing community relationships according to customary law. Colonial requirements often forced chiefs to act in ways that contradicted these traditional sources of legitimacy, creating impossible conflicts between maintaining traditional authority and satisfying colonial demands. External pressures included the systematic colonial effort to replace traditional governance with colonial administrative systems that offered no meaningful role for traditional leadership except as subordinate functionaries within colonial bureaucracy. Colonial policies deliberately undermined the economic, legal, and social foundations that had supported traditional authority, making it impossible for traditional leaders to maintain their previous roles, even if they were willing to accommodate colonial requirements. The role of individuals versus historical forces in this transformation reveals how personal decisions by both traditional leaders and colonial officials influenced the specific ways that traditional authority declined, but also how broader structural forces made some form of transformation inevitable regardless of individual choices. Traditional leaders who were skilled at adaptation and negotiation might delay or modify the decline of their authority, but they couldn't prevent fundamental changes that resulted from the systematic nature of colonial transformation. What could have been done differently includes alternative approaches to colonial traditional relationships that might have preserved more space for traditional governance within colonial systems. Some colonial administrators experimented with indirect rule systems that maintained traditional leadership while incorporating traditional authorities into colonial administrative structures. But these experiments were generally limited and ultimately subordinated traditional authority to colonial requirements. Traditional leaders might have been more effective at preserving their authority as they had developed stronger networks of cooperation and resistance, but such coordination was difficult given the geographic isolation of many communities and the colonial strategy of dealing with traditional leaders individually rather than collectively. The absence of written communication systems and the disruption of traditional networks by colonial administrative boundaries also limited possibilities for coordinated resistance. The question of inevitability versus contingency in historical change suggests that while the specific details of how traditional authority declined varied from place to place, depending on local circumstances and individual decisions, some form of fundamental transformation was probably inevitable given the systematic nature of colonial pressure and the structural incompatibilities between traditional and colonial governance systems. Economic factors played a crucial role in the decline of traditional authority, because colonial economic policies systematically transferred control over resources and economic activities from traditional leaders to colonial administrators. Traditional chiefs who lost control over land allocation, agricultural planning, and resource distribution also lost the material foundation for their authority, making it impossible to maintain traditional leadership roles even when cultural respect for traditional authority persisted. The technological and organizational advantages of colonial systems in areas such as military force, administrative efficiency, and economic integration made it difficult for traditional systems to compete effectively, even when traditional approaches might have been more appropriate for local conditions and community needs. The immediate aftermath of the decline of traditional chiefly authority was a period of cultural and political confusion that left communities struggling to maintain social cohesion and identity without the governance structures that had previously provided stability and direction. The description of this transitional period resembles the disorientation experienced by people who have lost their GPS system while driving in unfamiliar territory. They know they need to get somewhere, but they're not sure how to navigate. Without the guidance systems they had previously relied upon, who stepped into the vacuum by the decline of traditional authority, included colonial administrators who assumed direct control over functions that had previously been managed by traditional leaders, but who often lacked the cultural knowledge and community relationships necessary to perform these functions effectively. The result was often a period of administrative inefficiency and social disruption As colonial officials struggled to manage communities, they didn't understand using systems that weren't designed for African social conditions. Educated Africans, who had acquired colonial administrative skills, sometimes assumed leadership roles in their communities. But they faced the challenge of establishing legitimacy with people who associated authority with traditional qualifications rather than colonial education. These emerging leaders had to navigate between colonial expectations that they implement colonial policies and community expectations that they serve traditional community interests. Short-term consequences of the leadership transition included increased social conflict as communities struggled to resolve disputes without traditional mediation systems, economic disruption as traditional approaches to resource management were replaced by colonial systems that didn't account for local conditions, and cultural confusion as traditional practices lost institutional support, while colonial alternatives remained unfamiliar and often inappropriate. Contemporary reactions to the decline of traditional authority varied widely, from relief among people who had felt oppressed by traditional hierarchies, to grief among people who valued traditional cultural practices and social relationships. Many community members experienced conflicted emotions about changes that offered new opportunities while threatening familiar sources of identity and belonging. The attempts at revival or continuation of traditional authority took various forms, including efforts to maintain traditional cultural practices even when traditional political authority was no longer viable, the development of cultural organizations that preserve traditional knowledge and practices, and political movements that sought to incorporate traditional values into modern governance systems. Some communities attempted to maintain parallel traditional leadership structures alongside colonial administration, creating dual authority systems that allowed traditional leaders to continue serving cultural and social functions even when their political authority was limited. These hybrid arrangements sometimes provided continuity during the transition period, but they also created confusion about authority and responsibility that complicated community decision-making. The immediate legacy also included the preservation of traditional knowledge and practices by people who recognized their cultural value even when their political relevance had diminished. This cultural preservation activity often involved women, elders, and other community members who had not held formal political authority, but who understood the importance of maintaining cultural continuity for future generations. The legacy of traditional African chiefly leadership shaped later developments in ways that would surprise people who assumed that colonialism completely destroyed traditional institutions and replaced them with European alternatives. In reality, the influence of traditional governance systems persisted long after formal traditional authority had been eliminated, affecting everything from post-independence political structures to contemporary approaches to community organization and conflict resolution. Specific influences of traditional leadership can be seen in the emphasis on consensus building and collective decision-making that characterized many African independence movements and post-independence governments. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and Kenneth Kaunda drew explicitly on traditional African political concepts when developing their visions for independent African states, incorporating ideas about community responsibility, collective ownership, and participatory decision-making that reflected traditional governance principles. How later generations viewed traditional leadership evolved from the immediate post-colonial period, when many African intellectuals and politicians rejected traditional institutions as obstacles to modernization, to more recent periods when scholars and political leaders have increasingly recognized the value of traditional approaches to governance, community organization, and conflict resolution. This evolution reflects growing recognition that traditional African societies had developed sophisticated solutions to social and political problems that remain relevant for contemporary challenges. Myths versus realities that developed around traditional African leadership include both romanticized versions that portray traditional societies as harmonious utopias without conflict or inequality, and negative stereotypes that characterize traditional leadership, primitive despotism, that oppressed African peoples. Neither extreme accurately represents the complexity of traditional governance systems, which included both effective mechanisms for maintaining social stability and inherent limitations and contradictions. The reality was that traditional African leadership systems represented sophisticated approaches to governance that were well adapted to the social, economic, and environmental conditions of pre-colonial Africa, but which faced serious challenges when confronted with colonial pressure and the demands of integration into global economic and political systems. Understanding this complexity is essential for appreciating both the achievements of traditional African societies and the challenges they faced during the colonial period. Why traditional leadership remained important after its formal elimination relates to the fact that the social values, cultural practices, and organizational approaches that had supported traditional governance continued to influence how people understood authority, community responsibility, and social relationships, even when traditional political structures were replaced by colonial and post-colonial alternatives. The cultural foundations that had sustained traditional leadership continued to shape African approaches to political and social organization. The influence on post-independence African politics can be seen in the emphasis on single-party states that claim to represent national consensus rather than competing interests, in approaches to economic development that emphasized collective ownership and community responsibility, and in conflict resolution mechanisms that prioritized reconciliation and social harmony over punishment and retribution. These political approaches often reflected traditional African concepts, even when they were implemented through modern institutional structures. Academic study of traditional African leadership has evolved from early anthropological accounts that focus primarily on exotic cultural practices to more sophisticated analyses that recognize traditional governance systems as rational responses to specific social and environmental conditions. Contemporary scholarship increasingly recognizes traditional African political systems as important contributions to human understanding of governance, democracy, and social organization. The continuing scholarly interest in traditional African leadership reflects recognition that traditional societies developed innovative solutions to universal human problems related to authority, legitimacy, conflict resolution, and community organization. These solutions offer insights that remain relevant for contemporary discussions about governance, democracy, and social organization in both African and non-African contexts. Modern African political leaders have increasingly drawn on traditional concepts and practices when addressing contemporary challenges, recognizing that traditional approaches to governance offer valuable alternatives to Western political models that may not be well suited to African social conditions and cultural values. Today, we can see echoes of traditional African chiefly leadership in contemporary examples that range from community organizing strategies to corporate management approaches, revealing how the fundamental principles of traditional governance remain relevant for modern challenges even when the specific institutional structures have changed dramatically. Specific parallels between traditional African leadership and modern community organizing include the emphasis on consensus building, the importance of maintaining relationships between different constituencies, and the focus on addressing underlying causes of conflict rather than simply managing symptoms. Community organizers who work in diverse neighborhoods often employ strategies that resemble traditional African approaches to building coalitions, mediating between competing interests, and developing solutions that address community needs while maintaining social harmony. The restorative justice movement in contemporary criminal justice systems draws explicitly on traditional African approaches to conflict resolution that emphasized repairing relationships and reintegrating offenders into community life, rather than simply punishing wrongdoing. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, and other post-conflict societies have incorporated traditional African concepts of justice that prioritize healing and social reconstruction over retribution. Modern environmental management increasingly recognizes the value of traditional African approaches to sustainable resource use that emphasized long-term community responsibility rather than short-term individual profit. Indigenous knowledge systems that inform traditional African agricultural and environmental practices are being rediscovered by contemporary environmental scientists who recognize their effectiveness at maintaining ecological balance while supporting human communities. What hasn't changed about human nature becomes apparent when comparing the challenges faced by traditional African chiefs with those confronted by modern leaders in various contexts. The need to balance competing interests, manage scarce resources, maintain social cohesion, and adapt to changing circumstances remains constant across different historical periods and cultural contexts. The specific tools and techniques may change, but the fundamental leadership challenges remain remarkably similar. Similar patterns in different contexts can be seen in the way that effective modern leaders employ strategies that resemble traditional African approaches to governance, building personal relationships with constituents, emphasizing consultation and consensus building in decision-making processes, focusing on long-term community welfare rather than short-term individual gains, and maintaining cultural sensitivity while adapting to changing circumstances. Corporate management approaches increasingly recognize the value of leadership styles that emphasize collaboration, cultural awareness, and long-term relationship building rather than authoritarian decision-making and short-term profit maximization. These management philosophies often reflect principles that were central to traditional African governance, even when corporate leaders are not explicitly aware of these historical connections. Lessons for contemporary issues include recognition that effective leadership requires deep understanding of the communities being served, that sustainable solutions must account for cultural values and social relationships, and that decision-making processes that emphasize participation and consensus building often produce more durable outcomes than top-down approaches that ignore community input. The contemporary relevance of traditional African leadership principles can be seen in discussions about participatory democracy, community-based development, and alternative approaches to governance that emphasize local knowledge and community autonomy, rather than centralized authority and standardized procedures. These discussions often rediscover principles that were central to traditional African political systems. Modern challenges, such as climate change, economic inequality, and social fragmentation require leadership approaches that can build coalitions across diverse constituencies, develop long-term strategies that account for complex interdependencies, and maintain social cohesion while managing difficult transitions. Traditional African leadership systems develop sophisticated approaches to exactly these types of challenges. The global spread of democratic movements increasingly recognizes that democracy takes different forms in different cultural contexts, and that effective democratic governance must build on cultural foundations rather than imposing standardized institutional structures. This recognition has led to renewed interest in traditional African approaches to participatory decision-making and consensus-building. International development programs have gradually shifted from top-down approaches that imposed external solutions to more participatory approaches that emphasize community ownership and cultural appropriateness. This shift reflects growing recognition that sustainable development requires approaches that resemble traditional African governance principles rather than Western institutional models. The persistence of these patterns across different historical periods and cultural contexts suggests that traditional African leadership systems reflected universal human needs and capabilities rather than culturally specific approaches that were only relevant to particular social conditions. The key takeaways from studying traditional African chiefly leadership extend far beyond historical curiosity to offer practical insights for contemporary challenges related to governance, community organization, and social leadership. These lessons demonstrate that traditional African societies developed sophisticated solutions to universal human problems that remain relevant for modern circumstances. Even when the specific institutional structures have changed, universal truths revealed by traditional African leadership include the recognition that effective governance requires deep cultural knowledge and personal relationships with the communities being served. Traditional chiefs succeeded because they understood the social networks, cultural values, and historical context that shaped their community's needs and priorities. Modern leaders who attempt to govern without this cultural foundation often struggle to develop policies and programs that actually address community needs. Warnings for today from the traditional African experience with external pressure and the challenges of maintaining cultural identity while adapting to changing circumstances. Traditional communities that were most successful at surviving colonial pressure were those that developed flexible strategies for selective adaptation while preserving core cultural values. Contemporary communities facing globalization, technological change, or political pressure can learn from these historical examples about the importance of strategic adaptation without complete cultural surrender. Inspirational elements of traditional African leadership include the emphasis on service to community rather than personal advancement, the commitment to consensus building and inclusive decision-making, and the focus on long-term community welfare rather than short-term individual gains. These values offer alternatives to contemporary leadership approaches that prioritize individual success and short-term results over community well-being and sustainable development. Practical lessons for modern leaders include the importance of consultation and relationship building in decision-making processes, the value of understanding cultural context when developing policies or programs, and the necessity of maintaining credibility through consistent demonstration of competence and integrity. Traditional African chiefs who lost community support usually failed because they violated these fundamental leadership principles. The traditional African emphasis on restorative rather than punitive approaches to conflict resolution offers valuable insights for contemporary justice systems, organizational management, and international relations. Traditional approaches that focused on repairing relationships and addressing underlying causes of conflict often produced more durable solutions than punitive approaches that simply address symptoms. Why this history matters now becomes clear when we recognize that many contemporary challenges, such as environmental degradation, social inequality, and political fragmentation, require leadership approaches that can build coalitions, develop long-term strategies, and maintain social cohesion while managing difficult transitions. Traditional African leadership systems developed sophisticated approaches to exactly these types of challenges. The traditional African recognition that individual welfare is inseparable from community welfare offers important insights for contemporary discussions about sustainable development, social responsibility, and the limitations of individualistic approaches to social and economic problems. Traditional African societies understood that community prosperity required attention to collective needs and shared resources, rather than focusing exclusively on individual advancement. The importance of cultural continuity in maintaining social stability suggests that contemporary societies need to find ways of preserving valuable cultural traditions while adapting to changing circumstances, rather than assuming that modernization requires complete abandonment of traditional practices and values. Even now, traditional African chiefly leadership influences contemporary African politics, international development programs, academic research, and popular culture in ways that demonstrate the continuing relevance of traditional governance principles for modern challenges. This influence operates both through explicit recognition of traditional concepts and through unconscious adoption of approaches that reflect traditional African values and practices. Academic study of traditional African leadership continues to evolve as scholars develop more sophisticated understanding of traditional governance systems and their relevance for a contemporary political theory. Recent scholarship has moved beyond simple descriptions of traditional practices to analysis of how traditional African concepts contribute to broader understanding of democracy, legitimacy, authority, and social organization. Popular culture representations of traditional African leadership have become more nuanced and accurate as African voices have gained prominence in global media, and as awareness of African history has increased. Contemporary films, literature, and artistic expressions increasingly portray traditional African societies as complex civilizations with sophisticated governance systems, rather than primitive societies lacking political organization. Political discourse in contemporary Africa increasingly draws on traditional concepts and practices when addressing governance challenges, conflict resolution, and social organization. African political leaders and civil society organizations often explicitly reference traditional African values and practices when developing alternatives to Western political models that may not be appropriate for African social conditions. Social movements throughout Africa and the diaspora have incorporated traditional African leadership principles into their organizing strategies, emphasizing consensus building, community responsibility, and collective decision-making rather than hierarchical authority and individual leadership. These movements demonstrate the continuing relevance of traditional African governance principles for contemporary social and political challenges. Why people still care about traditional African leadership relates to recognition that traditional societies developed effective solutions to universal human problems that remain relevant for contemporary circumstances. The study of traditional African governance offers insights into alternative approaches to leadership, democracy, and social organization that may be more effective than Western models for addressing contemporary challenges. The continuing influence also reflects growing recognition that African societies made important contributions to human civilization that were overlooked or minimized by colonial and post-colonial scholarship that emphasized European achievements while ignoring African innovations. Contemporary interest in traditional African leadership represents part of a broader effort to develop more accurate and complete understanding of human history and cultural diversity. Looking back across the daily life of Kwame and the broader experience of traditional African chiefly leadership, we've seen a governance system that combined the complexity of modern corporate management with the intimacy of family counseling, the spiritual depth of religious ministry with the practical demands of municipal administration, and the diplomatic skills of international relations with the hands-on problem-solving of emergency response coordination, all wrapped up in a job description that would make contemporary human resources departments weep with confusion. Major themes that emerged from our exploration include the extraordinary scope of traditional chiefly responsibilities, which encompassed every aspect of community life from dispute resolution and resource management to spiritual guidance and cultural preservation. Traditional chiefs served as the ultimate generalists in societies that required leaders who could seamlessly transition from mediating chicken theft cases to managing food crises to conducting religious ceremonies, often within the same day, and sometimes within the same hour. Key patterns revealed throughout this journey include the fundamental tension between individual authority and collective decision-making that characterize traditional African governance, the constant balancing act between preserving cultural traditions and adapting to changing circumstances, and the remarkable resilience of communities that manage to maintain social cohesion and cultural identity despite facing challenges that would overwhelm many modern institutions. The most surprising discoveries include the sophistication of traditional governance systems that operated without written laws, formal bureaucracies, or institutional hierarchies, yet managed to maintain social stability, and community welfare for centuries. The complexity of daily leadership responsibilities revealed that traditional African societies were far more organizationally sophisticated than colonial stereotypes suggested, developing innovative solutions to governance challenges that remain relevant for contemporary leadership situations. The most important takeaways from this exploration include recognition that effective leadership requires deep cultural knowledge and personal relationships with the communities being served, that sustainable governance must balance individual needs with collective welfare, and that successful adaptation to changing circumstances requires maintaining core cultural values while developing flexible strategies for addressing new challenges. How our understanding has evolved throughout this journey reflects the broader historical pattern of recognizing the complexity and sophistication of traditional African societies that were previously misunderstood or misrepresented by colonial and post-colonial scholarship. The detailed examination of daily leadership challenges reveals that traditional African chiefs faced governance problems that were often more complex than those confronted by contemporary leaders, yet developed solutions that were remarkably effective given the resources and institutional structures available to them. The progression from morning routines through crisis management to colonial transformation and ultimate decline illustrates both the impressive adaptability of traditional governance systems and their vulnerability to systematic external pressure that attacked the cultural and economic foundations that supported traditional authority. This progression demonstrates that even sophisticated and effective governance systems can be undermined when the social conditions that support them are fundamentally altered. The journey also reveals the human dimension of historical change, showing how individual leaders like Kwame navigated impossible circumstances while trying to serve their communities, preserve their cultural traditions, and adapt to changing realities that often require them to compromise the very values and practices that legitimize their authority. Perhaps most remarkable about our exploration of traditional African chiefly leadership is how it reveals fundamental truths about human nature that transcend specific cultural contexts and historical periods, demonstrating that certain challenges and opportunities in leadership and community organization remain constant despite dramatic changes in technology, social organization, and political systems. What stays constant across different historical periods and cultural contexts includes the fundamental human need for leadership that combines practical competence with moral authority, the universal challenge of balancing individual desires with collective needs, and the persistent tension between maintaining stability and adapting to changing circumstances. Kwame's daily struggles with mediating disputes, managing resources, and maintaining community harmony reflect leadership challenges that remain relevant for contemporary managers, politicians, and community organizers. What changes are the specific tools, techniques, and institutional structures available for addressing these universal challenges? But the underlying human dynamics remain remarkably similar. Traditional African chiefs used oral communication, personal relationships, and cultural knowledge to build consensus and resolve conflicts, while modern leaders might use digital communication, formal procedures, and technical expertise. But the fundamental requirements for understanding people, building trust, and developing workable solutions remain the same. How people adapt to changing circumstances reveals both the remarkable flexibility of human communities and the importance of cultural continuity in maintaining social stability. Traditional African societies demonstrated extraordinary creativity in developing governance solutions that worked within their specific environmental and social conditions, while also showing impressive adaptability when circumstances required modifications to traditional practices. The universal struggles revealed by traditional African leadership include the challenge of maintaining authority while remaining accountable to the community, the difficulty of making decisions with incomplete information under time pressure, and the ongoing tension between ideal principles and practical necessities. These struggles are immediately recognizable to anyone who has held leadership responsibilities in any cultural context. Timeless motivations that appear throughout our exploration include the desire for recognition and respect, the commitment to family and community welfare, the pursuit of security and prosperity, and the need for meaning and purpose in life. Traditional African chiefs were motivated by the same fundamental human needs that drive contemporary leaders, even though the specific expressions of these motivations varied according to cultural context. The human capacity for both cooperation and conflict appears consistently throughout traditional African governance, revealing how the same social dynamics that enable remarkable collective achievements can also generate serious disputes and divisions when not carefully managed. Traditional chiefs had to work constantly to maintain the delicate balance between different personalities, interests, and priorities that exists in any human community. The persistence of certain personality types across different historical contexts suggests that leadership challenges often stem from universal human characteristics rather than specific cultural or technological circumstances. Traditional African communities included individuals who were generous and selfish, wise and foolish, cooperative and difficult, just like contemporary communities, requiring leaders who could work effectively with the full range of human personalities and motivations. The traditional African emphasis on collective responsibility and mutual aid reveals human capacity for remarkable cooperation and sacrifice when communities develop cultural frameworks that emphasize shared values and common purposes. This demonstrates that competitive individualism is not the only possible approach to human organization, and that alternative cultural frameworks can generate impressive levels of social solidarity and collective achievement. The study of traditional African leadership also reveals the human tendency to idealize past societies while overlooking their limitations and challenges, suggesting that all human communities include both impressive achievements and significant problems that require ongoing attention and creative problem solving. One final compelling anecdote that encapsulates the broader themes of traditional African chiefly leadership involves Kwame's last official act as a traditional chief, which occurred during the transition to full colonial administrative control and perfectly captured both the dignity and the tragedy of traditional leadership under impossible circumstances. The incident began when a young mother brought her sick child to Kwame, seeking both practical help and spiritual guidance during a medical crisis that traditional healing methods had been unable to resolve. The woman had already tried consulting the community's traditional healers and spiritual advisors, but her child's condition was worsening, and she was desperate for any assistance that might save her baby's life. Under traditional circumstances, Kwame would have been able to organize community support for the family, coordinate with traditional healers to explore additional treatment options, and provide spiritual counsel that helped the mother cope with her fear and uncertainty. But by this time, colonial medical services had been established in the region, and colonial officials had made it clear that traditional healing practices were discouraged, and that medical emergencies should be referred to colonial health facilities. The colonial medical facility was located a day's walk from the community, required fees that the family couldn't afford, and operated according to procedures that conflicted with traditional concepts of healing and family responsibility. The colonial medical staff spoke different languages, followed different cultural practices, and showed little understanding of or respect for traditional beliefs about illness, healing, and spiritual intervention. Kwame found himself facing an impossible choice between recommending traditional healing approaches that might not be effective for this particular condition, or directing the family to colonial medical services that might provide better technical care that would be culturally alienating and financially impossible. Either choice involved risks and compromises that illustrated the fundamental conflicts between traditional and colonial approaches to community welfare. Why this story encapsulates the broader themes becomes clear. when we recognize how it demonstrates the practical consequences of the transition from traditional to colonial authority. Kwame's dilemma revealed how colonial systems often provided technical improvements in specific areas, while destroying the cultural and social frameworks that had previously supported community welfare and individual identity. What this incident reveals about the entire historical process is that the decline of traditional authority involved countless individual tragedies where people caught between traditional and colonial systems suffered because neither system alone could address their needs effectively. The mother's desperation reflected the broader community's loss of confidence in traditional institutions without gaining access to adequate colonial alternatives. How this connects to everything we've discussed becomes apparent when we understand that this single incident contained all the major themes of traditional African leadership: the chief's role as ultimate problem solver, the integration of practical and spiritual approaches to community challenges, the importance of cultural sensitivity in addressing people's needs, and the tragic consequences of destroying traditional systems without providing adequate replacements. The memorable final image is of Kwame walking with the mother and her sick child toward the colonial medical facility, carrying traditional medicinal herbs in case the colonial doctors couldn't help, and quietly singing traditional healing songs to comfort both the child and the mother during their journey. This image captures both the dignity of traditional leadership that continued to serve community needs despite official marginalization, and the tragic necessity of adapting to colonial requirements that often conflicted with traditional values and practices. In the end, the story of traditional African chiefly leadership reminds us that effective governance has always required the same fundamental qualities that we still value in contemporary leadership: deep understanding of the communities being served, genuine commitment to collective welfare over personal advancement, the wisdom to balance competing interests and demands, and the courage to make difficult decisions under uncertain circumstances. The connection to modern life becomes clear when we recognize that many of the challenges faced by traditional African chiefs, such as mediating between competing interests, managing scarce resources, maintaining social cohesion during periods of rapid change, and adapting traditional practices to new circumstances, remain central to contemporary leadership of both public and private contexts. What we should remember from this exploration is that traditional African societies developed sophisticated solutions to universal human problems that remain relevant for contemporary circumstances. The emphasis on consensus building, cultural sensitivity, and long-term community welfare offers valuable alternatives to leadership approaches that prioritize individual advancement, short-term results, and standardized solutions that ignore local conditions and cultural values. How history informs the present becomes apparent when we realize that the traditional African experience with external pressure, cultural adaptation, and institutional change provides insights for contemporary communities facing globalization, technological disruption, and political transformation. The strategies that traditional communities developed for maintaining cultural identity while adapting to changing circumstances remain relevant for modern societies struggling with